of kings, before the first empires carved their names into stone, there was a land of gods and men. Mesopotamia, the cradle of civilization. Here, the first cities rose from the dust, their temples reaching for the heavens, their people carving the stories of gods, rulers, and forgotten worlds into clay. We uncover their words, their monuments, their silent statues with eyes too large staring into eternity. Were they mere symbols of devotion, or something more? In temples raised on sacred ground, the faithful left offerings of stone and prayers of hope. In hidden chambers, artisans sculpted gods that have long since faded from memory, yet their presence lingers. What were these places truly for? Sacred shrines of worship, or seats of power that ruled more than just men? From the lost temples of Nippur to the palaces of Akkad, from the halls of Gudea to the warriors of Lagash, we piece together the fragments of a forgotten world. The sands of time may bury the past, but the echoes of history are never truly silent. Echoes of the first civilization. The art, temples, and power of ancient Mesopotamia. Pre-Sargonid art and architecture. We have excavations at some of the principal ancient cities founded or occupied during the earliest historical periods in Mesopotamia. Our total knowledge of the civilization created during these centuries and of the way of life that it engendered has been acquired from two principal sources. The first source of information comes from the study of material remains exposed or recovered by archaeologists, while the second source comes from the contents of written documents that their finds have made available to philologists. We are primarily concerned with the former source of information here, so we must now consider the archaeological finds in greater detail. We can once again organize this information under distinct headings. It may seem strange to us that sculptures made of stone should feature so significantly in Mesopotamian art. Material scarcity and remote sources gave it a rarity value appropriate to its general use. A fact that must initially be remembered is that all forms of Sumerian sculpture, whether statues in the round or relief carvings, were of a religious character and intended to perform some ritual function within the confines of a temple. In this respect, the most common art form, and perhaps the most characteristic of the early dynastic period, is the category of votive or personal statues, which are frequently mentioned in describing the contents of early Sumerian temples. Fortunately, the dedicatory inscriptions often found upon them leave little doubt about their intention. The effigy of an individual worshipper, translated into stone and placed in the sanctuary of a religious building, could be expected to intercede on his behalf with an appropriate deity. Nearly all the temples mentioned in the previous chapter contained such statues, whether lying displaced or broken beside the brick benches on which they had stood, carefully buried beneath the floor of a sanctuary, or even built into the structure of an altar. Their recovery has contributed to the enormous volume of Sumerian sculpture now available for study. All that is now lacking in this field of discovery are the actual cult statues themselves, which must have stood upon the altar platform, creating a focal point for the liturgy of Sumerian religious ritual. Among the cache of discarded sculptures found in the square temple at Tell Asmar, a pair of male and female figures, almost half life-size, were tentatively identified by Henri Frankfurt as god and goddess by symbols carved on the base of the male figure. But most other critics don't believe these things, or that their eyes are too big when they stare. Instead, they see an attitude of prayer in them that is shared by all the smaller, less showy votive figures. Their hands are folded and they are holding a cup that a libation is about to be poured. These and other details suggest that the figure represents a worshipper rather than an object of worship. At Asher II in the archaic Ishtar temple, W. André imagined a gypsum figure of the deity in high relief above the altar, since a miniature version of such a figure had been found among the debris of the sanctuary. 20. This proposal also did not prove wholly acceptable, since no imprint had been left upon the wall. It is not improbable that cult statues generally were too valuable and too easily removed to be likely to have survived. It was Frankfurt again who first attempted a stylistic analysis of these sculptures, using mainly as his study material the 200 or so complete or fragmentary statues recovered from temples at the Diyala sites. Despite their regional quirks, he distinguished between two stages in developing their typical style, an earlier and a later style of carving, which corresponded, at least in the Diyala region, to the second and third phases of the early dynastic period. Only the few surviving works of proto-literate sculptors, some of whom we have already mentioned, exhibit the earlier two carving styles. Of these, the only object comparable to our votive statues of later times is a rather crudely carved female figure from a Jemdet Nasser provenance at Kafage, whose hands, folded around some missing object, already suggest an attitude of worship. However, this object is not related to Frankfurt's earlier dynastic sculpture, because it was made during the early dynastic I period, which has not yet been firmly linked to a single sculpture work. We are justified in concluding that the early dynastic II style, which we will consider, developed independently of any traditional influence. Its characteristics may perhaps be best seen in the statues from the square temple at Tell Asmar, all of which appear to be attributable to a single school of sculptors. Of the worshippers in this group, 9 are men dressed in the conventional garment of the period, a simple skirt of wool with a girdle and long fringe. A bald and clean-shaven priest stands out among the others, their square beards and long hair neatly corrugated and painted black. Their eyes are inlaid with shells and lapis lazuli. The 12th sculpture is the kneeling figure of a priest carved in alabaster, ritually naked and wearing a toque-like headdress. The 2 female figures also wear conventional garments, passing diagonally across the breast and draped over the left shoulder. As to their hairstyle, they show 2 variations of an arrangement common to both the second and third early dynastic phases. A halo plait passing vertically over the crown of the head with a chignon behind. However, this period also showcases a variety of other artistic devices. The stylistic peculiarity of these figures consists mainly of the distinctive rendering of the human body by reducing its component shapes to abstract forms. The formal rules are the same for all statues, even if they look different. The sculptor has figured out a way to combine different features into a manageable set of semi-geometric equations. However, one could argue that the early stonecutters' lack of technical skill led to the general simplification of shapes. However, this skill suggests an interest in design, rather than actual representation. Incidentally, the contemporary figures modelled for metal casting present an intriguing contrast. In the early dynastic II period, metallurgy was already well understood. and some striking works in copper were among the finds at Khafaj and Tell Asmar. However, the designs are purely naturalistic and show no signs of deliberate formalization. Votive statuary from the later Sin temples at Khafaj primarily represented the early dynastic III style of sculpture for Frankfurt study. However, there are also many examples from other sites, both in Sumer and the Upper Mesopotamian provinces. That depended on Sumer, where the difference between the two styles is less clear. The sculptors of this later period have gained confidence. They have discarded the devices of formal simplification and are no longer afraid to interest themselves in the details of physical appearance. The subtler contours of the body are carefully modeled. Mouths and cheeks are shaped to give the facial expression. The corrugation of hair and beards is replaced by a pattern of curls, sometimes separated by drill holes. An even more conspicuous change has occurred in clothing design and portrayal. Now, for the first time, the so-called kaunikes appear. A weaving system covering the whole garment with petal-shaped tufts of wool in an overlapping pattern, thought of by some as an attempt to simulate sheepskin. Other art now freely depicts the statues despite their altered appearance. There is now a striking uniformity of style and artistic convention throughout Mesopotamia. Rigid conventions govern dress and personal appearance, disregarding regional differences in race or tradition. The idiosyncrasy, for instance, of shaving the head while growing a luxurious beard, which is seen in statues from Khafaj or Warka, is equally common at Mari on the upper Euphrates, where the population is predominantly un-Sumerian. In fact, from the Ishtar temple and other early dynastic shrines at this northern site, some of the finest and best preserved early dynastic statues are derived, several of them inscribed with their names and occupations. Some also, like the famous Ebih-il, superintendent of the temple, are shown seated upon a chair or stool, once more a convention that is to be seen at Khafaj and elsewhere. In some cases, only the women wear a polo's headdress, shaped like a beretta, and one has a kaunike outer garment draped over it. By contrast, the singer, Ur-Nanshe, is seated cross-legged on a cushion and has straight hair parted in the middle. Equally rare are sculptured figures other than human beings, such as the bearded cow in alabaster from the Nintu temple at Khafaj, which Delugaz suspected of being a cult statue. We should therefore accord to relief carving, since it is plentiful and of great interest. In the early dynastic times, this form of carving was best illustrated by a class of wall plaques made of stone or slate. They are square, perforated in the center, and decorated in relief with various pictorial scenes. People have widely discussed their purpose and proposed several ingenious suggestions. The most obvious conclusion is that they were attached to an inner wall face by a central peg, possibly with an ornamental head. This is supported by the fact that some examples show that the sides of the square have flanges of loose stone meant to be covered by the plaster around them. Usually 2 or 3 registers arrange the scenes, showcasing rows of figures participating in religious rituals or royal ceremonies. Some are intended to commemorate a particular event. In one well-known example, the nature of the occasion and the names of the participants are recorded by inscriptions. Ur-Nanshe, divine bailiff of Lagash, is seen carrying bricks to construct a temple, accompanied by his sons and attendants. But there were other, more standardized pictorial compositions, one of which had clearly become so stereotyped among Sumerian artisans that a missing fragment of a plaque from Khafaj could be restored by reference to a replica found at Ur, some 100 miles away. This was the well-known banqueting scene, where a royal person at the top register is being served food and drink, while below his empty chariot is being prepared. Musicians and domestic animals complete the pattern. As previously mentioned, we found an important sequence of these plaques at Nippur in levels 8 and 7B of the Inanna Temple. They have been carefully studied by D.P. Hansen, who points out that in the earliest examples, the figures are drawn with incised lines, but they are later made to project from a recessed background. The designs at this stage are restricted to simple motifs reminiscent of cylinder seals. Only in the second phase do they undergo detailed modelling, leading to the depiction of subjects such as those mentioned above. One may mention in passing that a musician depicted in a banqueting scene from level 2B at Nippur carries an 8-stringed lyre with a bull-headed sounding box, precisely similar to those found in the royal tombs at Ur, early dynastic 3A. Sumerian relief carving reaches high proficiency in the final phase of the early dynastic period. Unfortunately, few examples of major works from this period have survived, and our judgment must be based primarily on the monument known as the Stela of the Vultures, fragments of which were recovered by the French excavators of Tello and are now in the Louvre. The scenes, which are carved in horizontal registers on both sides of the stone, commemorate the victory of Eannatum, ruler of Lagash, over the neighbouring state of Umma. The king, wearing a helmet resembling that found in the tomb of Meskelamdug at Ur, leads a phalanx of his spearmen into battle, drives a chariot at the head of his light infantry, and afterward presides over the ceremonial burial of the dead. On the reverse side, the victory is symbolically attributed to his god, Ningirsu, the warrior god, son of Enlil, who gathers his victims in a net sealed with the image of Imdugud, the lion-headed eagle. The objective record of a tumultuous event thus culminates in expressing a religious abstraction. With its individual style of carving and ingenious pictorial composition, this monument is considered one of the finest documents of human history. Returning to the early dynastic II phase, other forms of stone sculpture are found in temples. Vases, for instance, or vase holders, with figures partly carved in the ground. An elaborately ornamental example from Tell Asmar depicts the naked and bearded hero, familiar with cylinder seals grasping 2 lions by their tails. In another, a kneeling priest, also naked, bears a vase on his head. However, another category of vessels has long remained an enigma because of their wide distribution in countries other than Mesopotamia. These are flat-bottomed bowls with almost vertical sides, made of soft greenstone, formerly called steatite, now more accurately identified as chlorite. Their carved designs are unique. For instance, a typical example from Kafaje, currently housed in the British Museum, depicts standing or seated Sumerian human figures holding spotted snakes, or stylized streams of water. These snakes or water streams undulate around the vase's face above and between mythical beasts and symbols. These include lions, leopards, and small bears with birds of prey and occasional scorpions. But also prominent and more unusual are humped bulls of the Zebu breed, which is not native to Mesopotamia. Some figures are sparingly enriched with inlays of paste or coloured stone. Most remarkable of all, however, is their wide geographical distribution. Almost identical examples have been found as far north as Mari, south of Sumer itself, at sites in the Arabian Gulf, and finally, as far away as Mohenjo-Daro in the Indus Valley. Some light has at last been thrown, at least on local manufacture, by finds at the extraordinary site called Tepe Yahya, south of Kerman, which lies on a main route from Sumer to northern India. Here, in a level dated to the late 3rd millennium BC, C.C. Lamberg-Karlovsky recovered over 1,000 fragments of these steatite vases, including some unfinished vessels and wasters, together with large pieces of the raw material from which they were being carved. Later, he discovered a nearby source that provided chlorite. 134. The excavator also confirmed that the designs deteriorated into simpler representations of reed architecture. 135. But their symbolic significance and the talismanic properties that made them so internationally popular remain a mystery. Like other Mesopotamian inhabitants, the Sumerians constructed their buildings of mud bricks, shaped in a four-sided mold and dried in the sun. Up to the end of the Proto-Literate period, small rectangular bricks laid flat in horizontal courses, German Richen, seem to have been the rule. But after a transitional period, covering the early dynastic I period, these disappeared completely, and a new method of building was adopted. Bricks were now slightly larger and piano-convex in shape, with rounded faces often marked with the impression of a finger or thumb. They were laid on edge like books on a shelf, successive courses leaning sideways in opposite directions to create a herringbone pattern, easily recognizable as a criterion of the second and third early dynastic phases. Kiln-baked bricks of the same shape proved more suitable for pavements and wall faces in parts of a building where water was used or for renovating an external facade. Some poor-quality stone was locally available at a few sites, such as Eridu, Ur, and Mari, and could be used for foundations or powdered to make gypsum plaster. For the rest, buildings of the early dynastic period are assumed to have had flat roofs constructed of palm trunks, brushwood and clay. Doors pivoted on an indented stone, while windows, generally small and high up in the walls, could be protected by perforated terracotta grills. Without suitable wood, columns supporting the roof were rare, but circular pillars, composed of segmentally shaped bricks, were not uncommon in major buildings. Temples. Many discussions have taken place regarding the planning of temples during this period. They can be divided into two classes. First, the high temples, raised on brick platforms or actual ziggurats, and second, those at ground level, sometimes enclosed by private dwelling houses. Unfortunately, for reasons that have been explained, very little is known about the planning and appearance of the former, and we can only assume some similarity to their prehistoric prototypes. In the second category, however, we are now provided with a dozen examples widely distributed among Sumerian cities, which share so many characteristics that a general analysis can be made of their design and function. The nuclear element in these temples is a rectangular sanctuary, with a door on one of the long sides, the bent axis approach. At one end there is a raised brick altar, and behind it a wall niche marks the position in which the cult statue must have stood. Elsewhere in the mid-sanctuary are smaller brick platforms or pedestals, usually referred to as offering tables, while brick benches along the bases of the walls serve, as we know, as emplacements for votive statues, asher. More portable forms of furniture included tall pottery stands in which some sort of foliage was placed, figures of carved stone or copper supporting vases or bowls of incense, karfage, agrab, ur, etc. Rushlights of copper, kish, and larger offering stands of stone or terracotta, sometimes simulating buildings, asher. Only the altar's actual structure provides explicit indications of the actual ritual. Its upper surface was sometimes protected by an inlaid slab of stone or slate, asmar, which ran a small terracotta drain, discharging into a concealed pottery jar, agrab. These provisions could suggest animal sacrifices or the pouring of libations, both portrayed on cylinder seals and elsewhere. In its simplest form, this sanctuary chamber needed only a buttressed outer facade, small towers flanking the entrance, and a modest annex containing a bread oven, asmar, single shrine temple, to fulfill the requirements of a religious building. As temples got bigger and more complicated, the main sanctuary described above stayed at the center of the plan. Depending on the site's shape and other restrictions, one could build extensions around it. The first addition, reflecting traditional precedents, would be rows of lateral chambers on either side, including one with a stairway giving access to the flat roof. Next, we could construct a forecourt by enclosing the open space typically present at the main entrance. This would be surrounded by subsidiary chambers, forming a small precinct through an outer gateway with flanking towers. This growth process is well illustrated by the Sin Temple at Kafaji, which in the final stages of its development still occupied an irregular-shaped site surrounded by private dwellings. A complete contrast is presented by other temples, for which an open site was available, making it possible for the building to be pre-planned and symmetrically composed. An unpretentious example is the square temple at Tell Asmar, which is neatly arranged around a central court, so that two minor shrines can be added to the main sanctuary. The excellent Shara temple at Tel Agrab is the best example of this more formal design because it wasn't limited by the site. Its huge outer walls surround several self-contained units, each with chambers arranged around its courtyard. In addition to the generously proportioned main sanctuary with its two-tiered altar and ranges of offering tables, two minor shrines are again added together with elaborate accommodation for resident priests. A comparative study of all these buildings and their shared characteristics has made it possible to visualize rather clearly the appearance and function of a typical place of worship in early Sumerian times. One example deviates from the architectural formula most generally accepted. In the Inanna temple complex at Nippur, besides a conventional bent-axis sanctuary, there is a second freestanding shrine, isolated in its own courtyard, and entered by a doorway centrally placed at the end opposite the altar. This arrangement became the basic principle of all Mesopotamian temple planning at the end of the early dynastic period. Before we leave Sumerian temples, we should discuss the apparent discrepancy between their modest architectural remains, apart from their function as a seasonal ceremonial and religious ritual setting. Their paramount function as centers for the economic and political administration of the state would likely lead one to expect larger and more pretentious buildings than those we have been describing. Let us, for instance, glance at a brief account given by H.W.F. Saggs of their status in this respect and the part that they played in the life of a Sumerian city. Bearing in mind that his views are not universally accepted, he says, "The government of the Sumerian city-states at this time, mid-3rd millennium BC, was hieratic. The city and its lands, with all its inhabitants, were the estate of the city god, with the ruler or priest-king, of whom Gilgamesh was a prototype, as his steward. The gods created man to do their service, whereas free citizens were the gods' servants. Their primary function was thus to serve the temple estates, or what was the same thing in ancient eyes. The humans who acted as the god's steward, namely the city's ensi, governor or prince. Each free citizen received an allotment from the god's estates in the temple lands. It is clear that, in the early days, the greater part of the land, perhaps all of it, belonged to the temple, which was let out to the people on a sharecropping basis. The ensi was the bailiff of the city deity. He administered the temple estates with a hierarchy of officials to serve him. Private. Until the final years of the early dynasties, when the more powerful ensis tended to divert public funds for the aggrandizement of their own families, private property ownership remained extremely rare. Into the rise of secular power, distinct from the religious authority, and perhaps to the confrontation under certain governors of Lagash. By that time, state rulers had begun to acquire, as we shall see, large palaces of their own. These perhaps relieved the pressure of space in the temples themselves. However, it's important to remember that scribes were still in high demand during the early dynastic period, and the amount of written documents accumulated during state administration remained relatively small. Let us now, therefore, consider what is known about such buildings from excavations. Palaces. Where secular buildings are concerned, those loosely described as palaces form the most obviously important group. Our imperfect understanding of their function and practical requirements hinders any commentary on their architecture. In the earliest phase of the historical period, the concept of a temple implied a seat of royalty and an administrative center for the ruling hierarchy. Later, however, a more effective separation must have occurred between church and state, for the king now had his own residence, presumably of a sort that could meet the requirements of political and ceremonial activity. It is these characteristics, therefore, that we should expect to find in our so-called palaces. There are 4 notable examples, of which 3 only, at Kish, Eridu, and Mari, have sufficient features in common to suggest a conventional formula for such buildings. The 4th is the Northern Palace at Tell Asmar, which seems to be a mixture of domestic units, each grouped around its courtyard during this period. 2 buildings, separated by a narrow alleyway, compose the palace complex at Kish, early dynastic Ila. The larger of them, approached through a towered gateway, is protected by duplicate outer walls and has a single interior courtyard, around which it is formally planned. Of the less heavily walled building annexed to it, the only distinct features are at one end a long hallway with 4 central columns, and at the other some columned loggia. Beyond this, neither plan is in any way self-explanatory. Equally enigmatic in most respects are the twin palaces of the early dynastic period, located outside the raised temple precinct at Eridu. Once again, double walls, buttressed like those at Kish, in a manner normally considered more appropriate for a temple, protect these palaces. Yet here also we see the earliest known example of an audience hall, or throne room, opening off a square central courtyard, an arrangement which we shall find adopted from now onwards as the basis of the main reception suite in all Mesopotamian palaces. This combination of the square courtyard and rectangular throne room is even more strikingly illustrated in the Palais Pré-Martinique, which French archaeologists have partially excavated beneath the southeast corner of the huge 8th century BC palace of Zimrilim at Mari. Whether or not this will be a single element of a much larger building, its importance as an independent unit is emphasized by the duplication of its outer walls on all 4 sides. Another aspect of the building confirms this, prompting the French to refer to it as a zone sacra. The rectangular hall has a small sanctuary at one end. The square court has ornamentally recessed wall faces and is provided with ritual installations of various sorts. Foundation deposits had been laid beneath the pavement of corridors separating the outer walls. If such discoveries seem strange in a building apparently dedicated to a secular purpose, it should be mentioned in advance that similar features occur in the main reception suite of the massive palace, built on the same site by Zimrilim some 7 centuries later. As we shall see, they have been subject to diverse interpretations. Cylinder seals. The transition from one phase of the early dynastic period to another is clearly reflected in the changing designs of cylinder seals. We have already observed a certain deterioration in the artistic quality of seal cutters' work toward the end of the Proto-Literate epoch, and little improvement is to be seen during the century or so that followed. All interest in mythology and religious symbolism seems to have been abandoned in favor of decorative compositions, based on the shapes of animals and plants, supplemented by meaningless ornament curiously reminiscent of textile designs. This brocade style, as it has been called, is the hallmark of the first early dynastic phase. A reversion to more intriguing and imaginative subjects begins early in Phase 2. One subject that revived and soon gained in popularity is animal contests. Attacks by lions on cattle and their defense by human or half-human guardian figures. In this role, the bearded hero reappears, and the bullman, now wearing a girdle and ornamental sidelocks beneath his horns. 47 intricate patterns are made from these figures, which are sometimes interlaced or inverted. However, there is little attempt at plastic rendering, and the linear design is undisciplined. Later, artists experimented with pictorial subjects like the well-known banqueting scene. But the results were unsuccessful. A notable innovation, however, is the occasional introduction of a pictographic inscription. In the 3rd early dynastic phase, seal-making finally attains its full status as miniature relief carving. The figures become more massive and are skillfully modelled. Lions and guardians alike are often depicted full face, and more ornamental species of ruminants are introduced. Scenes of combat are punctuated by empanelled inscriptions. Designs are occasionally divided horizontally into two registers. The most intriguing subjects chosen for these early dynastic three seals are the mythological or ceremonial scenes in which men and gods participate. Their interpretation has always depended largely on the evidence provided by Sumerian literature, and since more of this became available, many themes have been reliably identified. For instance, the sun god, Shamash, voyages in his boat through the cycle of night and day, surrounded by symbols that the texts explain. Then there is the fertility god on a throne, before which priests pour libations or pile offerings on an ornamental stand. More rarely portrayed is the ritual of marriage, which occurred between a god, Ningirsu, and a goddess, Bau, at the New Year's festival. However, secular banquet scenes make an alternative to religious subjects, sometimes attended by a burlesque orchestra of animals. Many of these motifs now appear in other forms of ornament, especially on objects from the royal tombs at Ur. The seals now use a wide variety of semi-precious stones as their material. The cylinder could even be capped with silver at either end, or, in rare cases, made of solid gold. Metallurgy and composite craftsmanship. Treasures recovered from early dynastic levels at Sumerian sites testify to the ability of specialists in several fields of craftsmanship. And in some of the most strikingly beautiful objects, one sees how their skills have been combined. 148. In a class by themselves are the metalsmiths, whose services must have been greatly in demand at all levels of society. Their products, in the form of weapons, implements, and utensils, have survived in enormous numbers, side by side with pictorial representations of the purposes for which they were used. In a well-known relief, spears, shields, and helmets of copper are to be seen. In another battle-axe, guardian figures in seal designs wield daggers with crescent-shaped handles. Rain rings with their animal mascots appear on chariots in battle scenes, and at a banquet, copper drinking tubes are used. For votive and ceremonial purposes, replicas of such objects were made of precious metals and delicately ornamented. The work of Sumerian goldsmiths ranks with that of the best artisans of any later age, and there were few technical processes with which they were still unfamiliar. They were proficient in fine hammered work and repoussé, chasing, engraving, granulation, and filigree. The perfection of their skill is seen in an object like the wig helmet of Mescalamdug, which Woolley has described as a veritable tour de force, beaten up from the flat, with locks of hair hammered in relief and individual hairs represented by finely chased lines. At the same time, some more simple objects, like the fluted cups and vases from the same tombs, show something more than mere technical competence. One recognizes a real talent for elegant design in their combination of shape and ornament. The work of craftsmen in gold and silver is again to be seen in the ornaments of female attendants in the Ur tombs. The gorgeous beech leaf headdresses, the gold and silver florally decorated combs, the wreaths composed of little amulets in the shape of bulls, rams, birds, and fish, and the huge boat-shaped earrings. The coppersmiths of the early dynastic period are responsible for the most remarkable casting accomplishments in another sphere. Examples of their work are already in evidence at Tell Asmar during its second phase, and they include the remarkable group in miniature: a chariot drawn by 4 onagers and driven by a bearded king. Technologically, this work is of special interest because it shows evidence of casting by the so-called cire perdue, or lost wax process, which now appears for the first time. Copper statues of naked priests, also known as heroes, were common finds in the Diyala temples and were equipped with attachments that made them suitable for use as offering stands. One of these, from a group of 3 found at Kafage, measured 76 centimeters high. while fragments of another from an early Dynastic III provenance at Tell Asmar showed it to have been life-size. Another realm in which early dynastic artisans excelled was that of inlaid ornaments in coloured stone and other materials. Its uses, perhaps developing from the cone mosaic technique of an earlier period, varied from pictorial friezes decorating the facades of buildings to the minuscule enrichment of precious objects. In the former case, carved figures of white limestone were set against a background of grey slate. Various coloured materials, laid in bitumen over a wooden core, formed a surface incrustation for small-scale ornamentation. This technique allowed for carving individual features in shell, bone, or mother-of-pearl, fitting them into a coloured background. The first discovery of these detached figures took place in Palisade at Kish. However, the abundant and often undamaged examples surviving among the Tomb's treasures revealed the medium's full possibilities. Gaming boards, toilet boxes, and the sounding boards of harps were some objects decorated in this way, often with spirited scenes recalling those on cylinder seals. Individual figures cut from shell or nacre could be engraved with additional detail, and the incisions could be filled with red or black paste. Flakes of lapis lazuli would then be fitted together to form a background, and the design would be enclosed in a formally patterned border of other colours. At Ur, the tour de force in this ornament category was the famous royal standard, with its scores of busy figures on either side, representing scenes of war and peace, thought by some to be the sounding box of some musical contrivance. We must consider examples of composite objects among the early dynastic art treasures. In their own category are musical instruments found in the Ur tombs, which Woolley extracted from the earth with meticulous care. We sometimes use the term harp loosely to refer to these instruments, as only two fit this description. The most common instrument was a lyre, with a rectangular wooden soundbox inlaid in coloured ornament, upright members at either end, and a crosspiece to which the strings were attached with wooden pegs for tuning. Usually, the body of the lyre had a frontal ornament of metal in the form of a bull's head. But there was also a boat-shaped lyre, with the copper figure of a stag set against the foremost upright. As we know from pictorial inlays found here and at Mari, these instruments could be held at chest level by a standing player or stand upright on the ground, between the player's knees. There was also a so-called harp lyre, with 12 strings attached to a single upright and a bull's head, reconstructed by Woolley for the British Museum. But R.D. Barnett has now shown how a study of its actual remains in Woolley's photographs and notebooks revealed the components of two separate instruments: the sounding box of a conventional lyre and the single upright member of a harp. 154. Combined with the figured inlay of their frontal panels and the gold or silver sheathing of their framework, the bull's head ornaments with their luxurious beards of gold or lapis lazuli add a final element of grandeur to a characteristic Sumerian design. If one more example is required, we should remember the so-called ram caught by its horns, which is not a ram but a he-goat, symbolizing the generative vitality of the animal kingdom. Its head and legs are gold, its belly is silver, and its fleece is part lapis and part shell. It also sheathes the stylized plant against which it stands in gold. One of a pair, this object was considered an ornamental support for a vessel or cult object. Painted pottery with geometric and figured designs reappears for the last time in Sumer during the first early dynastic phase, especially at the Diyala sites. This is the scarlet ware, which retained some characteristics of the fine polychrome pottery that preceded it in the Jemdet Nasser period. Technically, however, the decoration is less competently applied. The designs are in bright red paint, outlined in black over a buff or the yellowish slip, but the paint is friable, lacking the soapy burnish of its earlier prototype. The most common vessel form is a broad-shouldered jar with a shallow neck and one or more triangular lugs beneath the rim. The painted designs are in many ways unique. Groups of human and animal figures fill the panels that divide the vase's surface. In one example from Tell Asmar, 3 naked women are shown beating tambourines for the benefit of a tethered animal, which appears to be a sacred bull. Other conspicuously male animals are of the antelope type with twisted horns. A fine example from Carthage, now in the British Museum, has a more ambitious design, representing a wheeled chariot. After the brief appearance of these attractive vessels in the early dynastic Vultures and the 2 phases, painted decoration on pottery was completely abandoned. And it did not appear again at any period in southern Mesopotamia. A wide range of incised ornaments replaced the painting during the 2nd and 3rd early dynastic periods. These ornaments and alterations in the vessel's shapes enabled the determination of their manufacturing dates. In southern Iraq, the production of scarlet ware seems to have been confined to the Sumerian provinces east of the Tigris, extending to the present frontiers of Iran. It is fascinating to remember that, to the north, also, in an area reaching from Nineveh to the confines of Syria, the final phase of the painted pottery era was marked by the appearance of a new and remarkable form of design. This was the elaborately decorated ware, first found by Malawan in his deep sounding beneath the greatest of all Assyrian mounds, and since known as Ninevite 5. 157. He described these vessels as fruit stands with pedestal bases, high-necked vases with angular shoulders and ring, or pedestal bases, carinated bowls and other types. He adds, many of these vessels are overcrowded with designs, especially the bigger ones which depict long-necked giraffe-like goats, waterfowl, fish, and many monotonous geometric patterns. With its deep purple designs on a neutrally coloured ground, this pottery seems unrelated to the scarlet ware of the south, with which it is now known to be contemporary. 58. Here in the north, too. In the following phase, it was gradually replaced or accompanied by unpainted pottery, whose quality depended on fine clay and the elaboration of incised ornament. Current excavations at Eski Mosul and elsewhere are throwing the dynasty of Akkad and the Sumerian revival. The term pre-Sargonid, which is sometimes applied to the early dynastic period, serves in itself to emphasize the importance of the event that brought that period to an end. Sargon of Akkad's accession to power in about 2370 BC and his rapid subjection of the old Sumerian city-states resulted for the first time in the temporary supremacy of a Semitic element in the population of Mesopotamia. The transition from Sumerian to Akkadian rule must have portended a revolution in political ideas. Its magnitude will become apparent if we recollect the unchanging pattern of Sumerian history during the preceding centuries, and the peculiar conventions by which it was dictated. These latter are indeed implicit even in the formal statements of the king list, and they can be spelled out in a few words. The primary assumption here is that the land of Sumer was composed of several city-states, and that only one of them was supreme over the others at any given time. This one city maintained the overall kingship until it was forcibly transferred to another city. Also, each city had its own patron god, who owned the state. However, these tutelary deities remained unaffected by interstate conflicts. They were not held responsible for the rivalry of kings who were their agents, though disputes among themselves were equally frequent. Finally, although the cities were continually fighting either for supremacy or for adjustments to their frontiers, there remained among their rulers a strong sense of pride in the solidarity of the land itself. Remember, Sumer was considered a finite entity. The dozen or so city-states of which it was composed occupied a restricted territory, hardly larger than the modern Irish Republic, with northward extensions reaching no further than adjacent cities in North Syria, which shared the same culture. Sumerian ambitions did not reach beyond these limits, remoter lands being of little interest except where trading was concerned. The foundation of an Akkadian kingdom in the north changed all this. A new factor became apparent in its first ruler's dynamic authority and statesmanship. Unhampered by Sumerian tradition and the limitations it had imposed on earlier kings, Sargon's conception of monarchy was absolute, and his ambition pointed beyond the bounds of a united Sumer and Akkad. Sargon's ambition was not limited to ruling a united Sumer and Akkad, but extended to a larger vision for Mesopotamia. Before returning to the archaeological record, it is best to summarize facts regarding the origin and history of the Akkadian dynasty. The Akkadians' nomadic origin was quickly forgotten, and the Sumerians did not oppose or resent their invasion in the early texts. It seems that by the time of Sargon's accession, the central part of Mesopotamia, from the region of Nippur northward to the Hit-Samarra line, including the Diyala district, had long been known as the country of Akkad. This led to the general application of the Akkadian to the non-Sumerian peoples of Mesopotamia. Culturally, the most conspicuous distinction between the two ethnic groups was linguistic. The Akkadians had retained their own Semitic form of speech, and for writing purposes, were compelled to use an awkward adaptation of the old cuneiform script. Nevertheless, once it was perfected, this written form of Akkadian was destined to become the lingua franca of the Near East, where commercial and diplomatic correspondence was concerned. Despite these changes, Sargon's subjects continued to share the Sumerians' religious beliefs and social practices, highlighting the resilience of the Sumerian civilization. Sargon and his successors. The legend of Sargon's humble origin became a familiar theme in the literature of later times. The upbringing of an orphan boy by benevolent peasants and his employment as cupbearer to a king of Kish, whom he eventually replaced upon the throne. These were preliminaries to a spectacular military career which started with his defeat of Lugal-Zaghazi of Uruk, temporarily the paramount ruler of all Sumer. Having subdued the cities individually and washed his weapons in the lower sea, Sargon founded a new capital at Akkad. Unfortunately, this city is one of Mesopotamia's few important political centers, and its site has not yet been located. It seems to have been well to the north of the main Sumerian enclave, though still accessible by river to sea-going vessels. One notices some evidence of discrimination in favor of the Akkadian element among Sargon's supporters. Akkadian governors were installed in the other Sumerian cities, and the Sumerian language ceased to be used for administrative purposes. On the other hand, much time and energy were devoted to the restoration or rebuilding of old Sumerian religious monuments, and one remembers, for instance, that Sargon's own daughter became priestess of Mana, the moon god of Ur. As mentioned, Sargon's conquest of Sumer was just a prelude to his conquests beyond Mesopotamia's natural borders. His first venture carried him eastward into Elam, where he defeated the combined forces of 4 rulers, led by the king of Awan, and established a vice-royalty in the city of Susa, which from now on acquired a new political status. His second expedition followed the course of the Euphrates into northern Syria, where, according to his own account, the god Dagon gave him the upper region. This would imply that he gained access to the cedar forests of the Amanus Mountains and the Taurus silver mines. Later expeditions assured the allegiance of settlements around or beyond Nineveh. And there is a famous text known as the Epic of the King of Battle, which shows the king advancing deep into the heart of Anatolia to protect his own merchants from the exactions of a local ruler described as the King of Burushanda, somewhere in the region south of modern Kayseri. Also accepted with some reserve is an account of an expedition by sea that carried him as far as the southernmost extremity of the Arabian Gulf, and some credit is given to his claim to have crossed the Sea of the West to reach Cyprus and Crete. Successive enterprises of this sort led to the creation of a Mesopotamian empire in the political sense for the first time in history, facilitating the commercial exploitation of countries hitherto almost unknown. When northern routes opened up, people could get new sources of wood and metals. They could also get many goods that they couldn't get from the east through Elam. It became clearer that trade could happen by sea in the Arabian Gulf. Sargon's time records the ships of Dilmun, Magan, and Meluha, moored at the quayside in front of Agade. The first name, the island of Bahrain, is already mentioned as a commercial hub in texts from the early dynastic period. But if Magan is truly Oman, or the coast of Makran, then Meluha must be farther away and may have been connected to the modern civilization of the Indus Valley. By trade, at least, the Akkadian Empire had reached the limits of the known world. Sargon's reign lasted for 55 years, but before he died, he found it necessary to repress the first of a series of revolts, which also darkened the reigns of his successors. Of his sons, Remush was killed in a palace revolution, but Manish-Tusu, and, to a greater extent, his grandson, Naram-Sin, could continue the aggrandizement of the Akkadian Empire. Naram-Sin seems to have been a ruler of the same caliber as Sargon and, like him, became a hero of legend. His surviving monuments reflect some military operations that occupied his reign, 2291 to 2255 BC. For example, a campaign against a Hurrian king was commemorated in the north by a royal relief carved on a rock face at Pir Hussein, near Diyarbakir, now in the Istanbul Museum. Another rock sculpture at Darband-i-Gar in northwest Iran, perhaps post-Akkadian, records a victory over the Lullaby, one of the tribal peoples of Luristan, who presented a continual threat to the Mesopotamian frontier. And another similar victory is celebrated in the design of the famous Stela of Naram-Sin, discovered at Susa, and now in the Louvre. In terms of written records, one might anticipate references to the Akkadian kings in the archives of Ebla, a city that Sargon's armies once sacked. But in the end, the Guti or Gutians, neighbors of the Lullaby in the north, effectively overran the homeland of the Akkadians. This happened in the reign of Naram-Sin's successor, Shar-Gali-Shere. And since their onslaught coincided with a concerted uprising of the old Sumerian states, the government center in Agade was destroyed, and the empire disintegrated. The political chaos that ensued must have been considerable, for the compilers of the king list content themselves with the rhetorical question, who was king? Who was not king? Semi-anonymous barbarians ruled Mesopotamia for a century, leaving few monuments or comprehensible inscriptions behind. We have mentioned earlier in the present chapter the energy the Akkadian kings devoted to rebuilding temples and sanctuaries in the old Sumerian cities. In light of this, it's interesting to note that excavations at the sites have revealed only a few traces of their work. One explanation is that, in almost every case, the rebuilding process had been repeated a couple of hundred years later by the third dynasty kings of Ur, who perhaps intentionally concealed all evidence of their predecessors' accomplishments. It should be noted that these sites were excavated first when written texts and other removable antiquities were prioritized over architectural remains. We no longer need to emphasize the shortcomings of these early excavating systems. However, some selected examples may illustrate their relevance in the present context. When H.V. Hilprecht was digging at Nippur in 1899 and 1900, he found that the great Third Dynasty ziggurat covered the remains of an earlier one built by Naram-Sin of Akkad. But he didn't think it was possible to investigate further. Vincent Scheele at Sippar, Abu Haba, in 1893, encountered a massive religious temenos, originally founded by Sargon of Akkad, but could trace and record only part of the buildings that replaced it 1,000 years later. E. H. Banks at Bismaya, Adab, in 1903-4, during his search for tablets or statues, noted the existence of a palace, private houses and a cemetery, all of the Akkadian period, but made no records of them. By 1923-33, things were a little better when Chech Wattelin, working in the Inghara mound at Kish, could distinguish repairs and additions made to an older ziggurat in Akkadian times, and record contemporary graves in the A cemetery. At any traces of buildings dating from the Sargonid period were deeply buried beneath the ruins of later times. But Woolley was at least able to study and minutely record as many as 400 Akkadian graves. It remained for other British and American excavators in the 1930s to throw light on some peculiarities of Akkadian architecture. Tell Asmar. Reference has already been made to discovering a large and well-planned residential building dating from the early Dynastic III period at Tell Asmar in the Diyala region. At a slightly later date, it had been rebuilt on a much more pretentious scale, with walls over 2 meters thick and an overall dimension of 73 meters. 167. This so-called Northern Palace was adapted, like its predecessors, to an irregularly shaped site, and an analysis of its plans suggests its division into 3 distinct units. Centrally placed, one sees a suite of major residential and reception rooms whose function is easy to infer. Anne, led to this in the south and accessible from a narrow doorway, is a self-contained unit with its own courtyard. One may recollect that the contents of its surrounding rooms, mirrors, ornaments, and toilet accessories, implied are occupied by women. Lastly, to the north, separated from the central suite by a system of courtyards leading to the main entrance, was a third unit with service accommodation. However, the most curious feature of this building was a range of variously shaped rooms on the east side, with built-in installations of kiln-baked bricks. These have served some purpose involving water use, since each had a drain leading to a brick-vaulted sewer in the narrow alleyway outside the building. One notices that there are indeed small lustral places or toilets annexed to larger rooms at other points in the plan, but these longer chambers to the east seem to have had some other function, which has led one authority to even suggest that the building has been wrongly identified as a palace. 168 brick shapes and other evidence from the earlier years of the Akkadian epoch date it chronologically. Kafage and Brak. Other evidence was that the Diyala sites were extensively occupied during the Akkadian period. Researchers exposed and carefully studied several private houses near the Northern Palace at Tell Asmar. 169. At Kafage, in an outlying part of the site, an enclosure wall had been built around a group of Akkadian buildings, of which only the foundations survived, and there were traces of an Akkadian occupation directly beneath the surface at Tel Arab. However, one of the most impressive and historically significant buildings dating from this period was discovered by Malawan at Tel Brak, 171, a little beyond the modern Syrian frontier in northern Mesopotamia. This again has been called a palace, but it would rather seem to have been a military outpost or fortified entrepot, occupying a strategic position on the trade route to southern Anatolia in the time of Naram Sin. Built upon a site overlying the prehistoric Eye Temple, referred to in an earlier chapter, only its foundations had in part survived. But from these, the plan could be restored of an approximately square building with immensely thick outer walls and a maximum dimension of overroom. As expected, the plan consisted largely of long storage chambers grouped around a system of open courts. Plundered after the fall of the Akkadian Empire and destroyed by fire, it was replaced by a less substantial building in the time of Ur-Nammu, 2103 to 2096 BC. Sculpture. Well-preserved examples of Akkadian sculpture are hardly more plentiful than surviving buildings of the period, which must be deplored if one considers the remarkably high quality of their achievement. Outstanding in this respect are 2 conspicuous monuments that chance circumstances have preserved for us. One is the life-size head in bronze of an Akkadian king, discovered out of context in the Assyrian ruins of the Ishtar temple at Ki Jik, Nineveh, and now in the Iraq Museum. Malawan, who had the good fortune to find it, provisionally identified it as a portrait of Sargon of Akkad, perhaps dedicated by his son Manishtusu, whose name is recorded as the temple's founder. The depiction of the king features an ornamental coiffure reminiscent of Mescalamdug's wig helmet or Eanatum's Stela of the Vultures. On the other hand, his moustache and divided beard have a new air of sophistication, and the modelling of his face shows a notable improvement in the work of Sumerian sculptors. The forcible removal of its valuable inlay damaged one of his eyes. The second most important monument of the Akkadian period is the Stela of Naram Sin, found by De Morgan at Susa, whither it had been brought by the Elamite king Shutruk Nakhkunte as part of the booty of Sipar. The purpose of this relief is to commemorate an Akkadian victory over the Lullaby tribe members. In a composition skillfully suggesting a campaign among wooded mountains, one's eye is drawn to the dominant figure of the king, standing high above his troops and protected by the symbols of his gods. Wearing a horned headdress to signify his divinity and carrying a bow, he tramples the enemy beneath his feet. Aesthetically, this is a magnificent design that emphasizes the creative ability of Akkadian artists. If additional evidence is required, we must search through more fragmentary remains from Susa and other locations. Pieces survive in the Louvre's other diorite stelae, depicting scenes from the triumphant aftermath of Sargon's victories over anonymous enemies. 174. Had these been less firmly dated, one would still have attributed them to an earlier phase in the stylistic development of Akkadian carving. Their horizontally arranged figures make these reliefs look much like their Sumerian ancestors. The Kaunaki's clothing is less clear, but the naked bodies of defeated enemies show that the artists had a better understanding of muscle structure. A striking advance in mastering such designs occurred during the time of Sargon's successors. Indeed, fragments of a similar stela can be found in Iraq. Some compensation for the paucity of Akkadian sculpture is provided by the rich harvest of contemporary cylinder seals recovered from graves and private houses at some of the sites we refer to. The skill and talent of the Akkadian seal cutters set a new standard for glyptic art in Mesopotamia. 176. There are some changes in their subject choice, but the main change is in their design and carving style. The aim of earlier artists had been to link their action-related figures together in a continuous frieze. This is now abandoned, and the new designs are contrived so that the seal's rotation produces a succession of self-contained tableaux, often isolated by impaneled inscriptions. The figures undergo significant changes as well. Typically, the figures are larger and more widely separated, with the carving depth providing a higher relief impression, and a significant focus on ornamental detail. By contrast, unfilled spaces between them emphasize their modeling and pattern harmony, while enhancing their outline. Among the mythical figures of earlier times, the naked hero and his companion, the demon-headed bull, are still to be seen in combat with horned animals or lions. Still, the contestants are separated, and the animals are often arranged antithetically, like the supporters in a heraldic design, with a central motif in between. Mythical and religious scenes are also popular again, but they must now be integrated into the framework of a static design. They are widely varied and of considerable interest. One can easily detect references to the familiar myths of Sumerian literature and the more conventional subjects of worship and ritual. Once more, the sun god appears in his boat, or the water god, with streams flowing from his body. There is the birdman Zu, who stole the tablets of destiny, Etana, who attempted to reach heaven on the back of an eagle, and many other figures of legend, which have been identified in the course of long studies devoted to the subject of these seals. Unique is an example dating from the Akkadian occupation of the Abu Temple at Tell Asmar, whose imagery, characteristic of the Indus Valley civilization, established one of the first chronological links with the contemporary cities of Mohenjo-Daro and Harappa. Finally, another site was where an American expedition in the late 1920s recovered important material from the Akkadian period. This was Nutsi in the neighborhood of Kirkuk, which became a city of some importance under its Hurrian rulers in the 15th century BC. Excavations beneath the Hurrian palace area produced evidence of continuous occupation throughout the 3rd and early 2nd millennia, during which time the place was known as Garsur. Already in the early dynastic period, a temple had existed here, dedicated to Ishtar, like the contemporary shrine at Ashur, which it closely resembled. Important finds near this building included a large collection of tablets, throwing much light on commerce and trade connections in the Akkadian period. Among old Assyrian texts are references to mercantile establishments in Anatolia, which lent new substance to the Sargonid legends associated with this subject. Other findings contributed to the unfamiliar typology of domestic and military equipment in the Akkadian period. Metal objects, seal cylinders, and pottery were plentiful, and could afterward be compared with those from contemporary levels at Tel Brak, with which they had more in common than with their counterparts in the south, Gutians and Lagash. The rarity of written texts obscures the situation in Mesopotamia during the long interregnum that followed the Gutian occupation. However, it seems unlikely that systematic control was maintained over the whole country. The interlude was, as we know, finally brought to an end early in the 22nd century BC by a military insurrection led by a ruler of Ur. Yet, some 60 years before this occurred, our attention was already drawn to the survival in the city of Lagash of a Sumerian ruler who had attained sufficient independence and wealth to restore its temples and reorganize the irrigation of its territory. This was Ur-Baba. His successor, Gudea, is well known in Mesopotamian history for two reasons. First, many inscriptions have been found that talk about his achievements. Second, he supported a group of hard stone sculptors who created some of the most beautiful works of Mesopotamian sculpture all these years later. From Gudea's records, we even learn of a successful military campaign against Elam and the dedication of its spoils to his god Ningirsu, the embellishment of whose temple, Nini, is described in much detail. Desazek. The modern spoils of Lagash, installed in the Louvre, are the results of excavations at the site called Tello, conducted by the French scholar-explorer Ernest Desazek during the final quarter of the last century. 181. To understand the sensation created by the arrival of his finds in Paris, one must recall that they provided the first substantial evidence of a civilization in Mesopotamia antecedent to that of the Assyrians, and that they remained unique in this respect until the resumption of excavations in southern Iraq after the First World War. Therefore, a summary of Desazek's discoveries may not be out of place. Tello. Tello is a huge site near the Shat al-Hai Canal, with a maximum diameter of about 0.9 miles. Of the principal mounds grouped near its center, identified by the French alphabetically, the most productive were Tel A, Palais, Tel K, Maison des Fruits, and Tel V, Tel des Tablettes. The finds made by illegal diggers drew Desazek to the site, and during his first two seasons of excavation, 1877 to 1878, he found a superb fragment de statue, foundation deposits with stone tablets and bronze figurines, two large inscribed clay cylinders, a fragment of the Vultures Stela, and a colossal statue that he left in place. These finds proved the importance of Tels A and K. Early in 1879, during his absence on leave, H. Rassam, representing the British Museum, slipped in and made some soundings of his own, but was frustrated by labour difficulties. A year later, Desazek returned and began a third campaign, resuming his excavation in Tel A. This time, Dessarzec's success was phenomenal. Boutin, an immense figure, arrived in France in May 1881. Until now, and during his fourth season, Dessarzec had been dealing with relics of the post-Akkadian phase in the history of Lagash. In his fifth and sixth campaigns, having transferred his activities to Tell Asmar, he became involved with the remains of an earlier period. Inscriptions were found mentioning the names of governors of Lagash: Unanshe, Eanatum, Entemena, and Urukagina, who had ruled the state in the early dynastic period. And an outstanding find, at this time bearing the name of Entemena, was the now famous silver vase, with its finely engraved symbolic design. Before Dessarzec died in 1901, there were 4 more campaigns. However, after the source, Tel Vai, from which illegal diggers had been getting large amounts of cuneiform tablets, was found in 1893, the French excavator's main job was to stop the site from being completely looted. Unfortunately, due to Dessarzec's declining health and other circumstances, the site remained unguarded for extended periods, allowing the robbers unrestricted access. Between 35,000 and 40,000 tablets entered Baghdad's markets during those years, compared to the 3,800 the French found in their excavations. Inscriptions identify the statues of Gudea and his son Ningirsu, which are either seated or standing and sometimes more than half life-size. They are carved from boulders of dense diorite, brought by a ship from Magan at the southern end of the Arabian Gulf. The exposed parts of the body show a refinement of modelling well suited to this material, and the sculptor's treatment of his subject conveys an impression of strength in repose. The sculptor sets the bearded and sometimes bald heads low in the shoulders, while the absence of coloured inlay benefits the eyes. 183. While admiring the masterly design of these sculptures, one is compelled to regret the loss of the temple in which they stood, and other rich furnishings that Gudea records having dedicated to his god Ningirsu. During his excavations, Dessarzec paid little attention to architectural remains. After his death, however, the work at Tello was resumed and continued intermittently until 1909 under the direction of Gaston Cros, who seems rapidly to have acquired the rudiments of the wall tracing technique. One gathers from A. Parrott's summary of his reports that he did much to clarify the site's topography. In Tel A, beneath the ruins of a palace built by an Aramean ruler in the 2nd century BC, he located what he considered to be some remains of the Ningirsu temple, and in Tel K, a fortification built by Gudea. Among his finds elsewhere, actually purchased, was a headless statue, subsequently reunited in the Louvre with the fragment till then known as the Tête au Turban at Hibia. More than 70 years after Dessarzec's death in 1972, extraordinary discoveries were made during a survey undertaken by Thom Jacobson and F. Safar, led to an excavation sponsored by the Metropolitan Museum and University of New York, under the leadership of V. E. Crawford, at a site called Al-Hiba, 15 miles southeast of Tello. Tablets, stamped bricks, and other objects, some associated with a temple building, revealed various Sumerian inscriptions. Their content provided indisputable proof that Al-Hiba was the site of the ancient city of Lagash. Further excavations may throw new light on this paradoxical situation. Still, for the present, it is only possible to conclude that the city discovered by Dessarzec at Tello, and now identified by its ancient name, Girsu, was a secondary political or religious center in the state of Lagash. The third dynasty of Ur. The Sumerian revival itself must be thought of as having begun in about 2120 BC, when Utu-Hegel, king of Uruk, initiated the first large-scale revolt against the tribal rulers. He was supported by the Sumerian governors of several other cities, and one of these, Ur-Nammu, seems to have replaced him after his first military successes. He completed the liberation of Sumer and founded the powerful third dynasty of Ur. thereby inaugurating what is sometimes called the Neo-Sumerian period. For a little over a century under this king and his four successors, Ur, like Agade, was the capital of an empire. Here, as elsewhere, much time was devoted to ambitious building programs, which have left their mark on the cities in the form of ziggurats, temples, and palaces. For our present purpose, therefore, it may be well to concentrate on Ur itself, whose site, Tel Mukhayar, was so thoroughly excavated by Woolley between the years 1922 and 1934. 185. Woolley published an overall plan of the city of Ur as he found it, with details of the fortifications partly restored. 8.6 rep presented here are, of course, the city walls as rebuilt by the Neo-Babylonian kings in the 6th century BC. But there is no reason to suppose that their outline differs greatly from those built in the time of Ur-Nammu, 15 centuries earlier. The town they enclose is formed into an irregular oval, with a maximum dimension of almost 1,200 meters, and in Ur-Nammu's time was already surrounded by a wall and a rampart. Woolley describes it as follows. The rampart was of mud brick with a steeply sloping outer face. The lower part was, in fact, a revetment against the side of the mound formed by the older town, but the upper part extended inwards over the top of the ruins to make a solid platform. Along the top of this was the proper wall, built of baked bricks. This massive fortification was further strengthened by the fact that the river Euphrates, as can be seen from the line of its old bed, washed the foot of the western rampart, while 50 yards from the foot of the eastern rampart had been dug a broad canal, which left the river immediately above the north end of the town. Consequently, a moat encircled Ur on 3 sides, allowing dry land to approach it only from the south. An Elamite army likely assaulted the walls from this side in 2006 BC, destroying the city. For Woolley adds, there is no trace of Ur-Nammu's wall remaining. We would devise examples of enormous bricks specially moulded with the king's name and titles, reused in some later buildings, but none were in situ. Just because the defences of Ur had been so strong, the victorious enemy had dismantled them with special care. The ziggurat. A second heavily buttressed enclosure wall surrounded the sacred temenos in the northwest part of the town. Woolley's plan of this precinct shows that it was considerably enlarged in the time of Nebuchadnezzar, whose new wall passed across the ruins of the 3rd Dynasty mausoleum, which had been sited just outside the old temenos, near the earlier royal tombs. Of the buildings inside the original enclosure, by far the most conspicuous was the colossal ziggurat, built by Ur-Nammu and completed by his son Shulgi. This amazing monument is better preserved than any other in Mesopotamia. Woolley carefully studied and wrote down information about it, and his famous perspective reconstruction of how it looked originally has recently helped the Iraqi government restore some of its ruins. It is a solid structure built in 3 stages. The core is of mud brick, probably laid around and over the ruins of an earlier tower, and it was faced with a skin of baked brick set in bitumen, about 2.4 meters thick. The lowest stage, which is best preserved, measures 61 by 45.7 meters at ground level and is about 15 meters high. The initial approach to the summit was by a triple stairway, with 3 converging flights and squat tower buttresses in the angles between them. Where they met, at the first terrace level, the remnants of 4 brick piers suggested some portico, which Woolley hypothetically provided with a domed roof. The height and dimensions of the 2 upper stages were ascertained, but they were also much denuded. Woolley observed 3 peculiar aspects of the ziggurat structure, for which he has offered tentative explanations. The fabric of the tower consisted of sun-dried brickwork reinforced with thick layers of woven reeds at intervals of 6 or 8 courses. He went deep into the building and saw that both the bricks and the mortar had become hard and discolored by fire. He thought this was because the structure had been soaked in water, maybe while it was in ruins for a short time, which caused the decaying plant matter inside to catch fire. Conversely, he was surprised by the multiplication of weeper holes penetrating the baked brick outer shell of the lowest stage. And he wondered whether the terrace above could have been planted with trees, which would have required irrigation. He had, in fact, found carbonized tree trunks near the base of the tower. Finally, he discovered a slight outward deviation in the line of the main facades at pavement level. He was tempted to compare this with the subtle distortion of perspective contrived by the builders of Greek temples 15 centuries later. Remembering the massive weight of the tower and the pliable quality of mud brick, others have mistrusted this explanation. Except for the mausoleum mentioned, all the major buildings originally founded by the kings of the Third Dynasty fell within the area of the old Temenos as it existed at that time. Mostly, the kings of the Third Dynasty rebuilt these buildings frequently. Making adjustments to their planning and arrangements and analyzing their ruins required a great deal of skill and patience. The task would have been impossible without the Akkadian convention of stamping baked bricks with royal inscriptions. Ur-Nammu built his ziggurat on a raised terrace, surrounded by double walls with intramural chambers, Eti Men Nigur. To this he added a second courtyard, with a monumental gateway at Temenos level, which he dedicated to Nanna, the patron god of Ur. Southeast of the ziggurat terrace was a huge and heavily fortified building called Gipar-U, dedicated to Ningal, the consort of Nanna, but also containing several minor shrines incorporated during its long and complicated architectural history. We probably should regard this as the Tifiemple, or ground-level sanctuary. People have identified a smaller square building, E Nunun Mak, in the angle between the two ziggurat courtyards as a palace, a temple, or a treasury. The main entrance to the ziggurat terrace in Ur-Nammu's time was B, a rather inconspicuous gateway in the eastern corner known as Idab Lalmach. Its outer portico looking southward over the more public part of the precinct contained a statue of Nanna and was used by the king as a seat of judgment. Later, rulers separated it from the terrace and made it into a court of law, with subsidiary chambers around it. Yet, almost 7 centuries later, the Kassite king Krigaltsu still called it the Great Gate, the Ancient One. 2 of the remaining Third Dynasty buildings only survived in their original form. One of these, in the southeast angle of the old precinct, was Karsag, clearly the residential palace of Ur-Nammu and his successors. The other was the mausoleum, about which there is more to say. 189. This formidable conglomeration of buildings comprised Ur-Nammu's tomb and his 2 immediate successors. Below the contemporary ground level were the burial chambers with corbelled brick vaults and long flights of steps leading down to them. Above these were the remains of elaborate and formally planned funerary chapels. It is important to recognize the looting of these ancient tombs as a significant tragedy. The first powerful imperial monarchs were buried with even more elaborate ceremonies, and in graves that were much more luxurious than the tombs of earlier dynasties, which were designed to be much more modest. Only the shell of the buildings with their vaulting partially intact remains, and Woolley found only gold leaf fragments to prove the treasure was taken. Almost without exception, the tombs of subsequent rulers in Mesopotamia have remained unlocated. The vaulted chambers had long flights of stairs leading down into them and were roofed with corbel-type vaulting composed of baked bricks. Woolley became aware of a curious circumstance when estimating the height of the chambers. It was evident that in the case of Ur-Nammu's tomb, the pavement on which the burial was actually laid out seemed a somewhat shoddy affair, and left a space between itself and the vault, in which there was only just room for a man to stand. He then found that the stairway went down several meters beneath this to a proper pavement with several courses of baked bricks set in bitumen. What had apparently happened was that when the tomb was actually constructed, the builders had not taken into account the flood level of subsurface water, so that when the king died and the time came for the tomb to be used, it was found to be filled with water to a considerable depth. The only remedy, therefore, was to fill it above the water level with rubble and then repave it. Evidently, the water level had receded since then, as Woolley could excavate all the tomb chambers down to the original pavement level. After shoring up the vaults with timber, visitors could walk around them. Today, we have permanently reconstructed the vaults more permanently, transforming them into a popular tourist attraction. Woolley, as usual, made an extremely thorough study of the surviving remains in the Ur mausoleum. He was even able to record details of a temporary superstructure that acted solely with the ritual ceremony of inhumation. This superstructure was later replaced by permanent memorial chapels. The period of the Sumerian revival coincided with a notable change in the planning of ordinary temples. They abandoned the bent-axis approach of earlier times in favor of a more obvious symmetry. The new plan, which was to survive with only minor variations throughout the remaining history of Babylonia, is to be seen in its simplest form at Tell Asmar, Eshnunna, where a subject prince dedicated a temple to Shusin, the deified king of Ur. 190 tower-flanked portals, vestibules, anticells, and inner sanctuaries were now aligned on opposite sides of a central court to create a single vista that terminated in the cult statue itself. However, the cardinal sequence of features around which the plan developed remained constant from that point on. As for the cult statue itself, upon which the liturgy of the Sumerian ritual was focused, some clue to its appearance may be sought in relief sculptures, where deities are depicted. Woolley found fragments of the so-called Stela of Ur-Nammu among the earliest remains of Idab Lal Mach, providing a rare example. This was a monument 3 meters high, divided horizontally to depict scenes connected with the building of a temple. In the only undamaged register, the king is twice depicted in confrontation, first with a god and then a goddess, perhaps Nannar and Ningal, before whom he pours a libation over some plant. We found fragments of a terracotta vessel, similar to where the plant grows, beside the altar in the Shusin temple. In contrast to the Sargonid relief's secular dynamism, this religious scene's tranquility is once more characteristically Sumerian. In the early years of the second millennium, with the Sumerian Empire disintegrating and several new states becoming actively independent, we are faced with an era of change in the political anatomy of Mesopotamia, which may once more justify a short historical digression. Of the two peoples jointly responsible for the downfall of Ur's third dynasty, the Amorites from Syria settled in Babylon and other cities to the north. At the same time, the Elamites returned eastward across the Zagros, leaving a governor of their own choosing in the Dayala state, Eshnunna, to guard their interests in Mesopotamia. In Sumer itself, meanwhile, throughout the whole of the 20th century BC, one watches two states, Isin, modern Bahriyat, and Larsa, modern Sankara, contending for control of the ancient cities and their sacred shrines. At first, Isin is in ascendancy, but its enemies are many, including Larsa, Eshnunna, and its Elamite allies. Furthermore, by the end of the century, two formidable new states had emerged from their previous obscurity to become prominent in the political scene: Mari, modern Tel Hariri, and Ashur, Kalat Sharkat, situated respectively on the middle courses of the Euphrates and Tigris. Also, in about 1900 BC, when Larsa appeared to be gaining the upper hand, a new dynasty was founded in Babylon, whose sixth ruler, Hammurabi, was destined to reshape the whole political pattern. Of the more northerly states mentioned above, Mari is one at which we should take a closer look. As we have said, its ruins lie on the west bank of the Euphrates, a little to the north of the modern Syrian frontier. The Sumerian king list attributes to it the status of a city with a dynasty of rulers. And sure enough, when a French expedition led by A. Parrott began excavating there in 1933, their first find was an early dynastic temple dedicated, like that at Ashur, which it closely resembled, to the goddess Ishtar. By the beginning of the second millennium BC, the place had acquired special importance as a station on the great trade route that brought timber and metal from Syria or the mines of the Taurus Mountains. When Babylon founded the first dynasty, its rulers enjoyed considerable prosperity. Their palace, which Parrott had the good fortune to find and the opportunity to excavate, was an enormous building that will presently be described, and it contained an archive of more than 20,000 tablets, revealing the city's history before its destruction by Hammurabi in about 1760 BC. The Mari tablets first introduce us to several obscure Semitic kings, and then to one more historical ruler, Iach-dun-lim, early in whose reign the city temporarily lost its independence and was annexed to the state of Ashur. One of the first really notable Assyrian kings, Shamshi-Adad I, is mentioned in this connection, concerning whom much is to be learned from the Mari archive. The city of Ashur occupied a strategic position on a shoulder of rock, overlooking the Tigris at a point well beyond the limits of the alluvial plain. 193. Like Mari, it was an important trading center, in contact with the southern cities and the sources of raw materials in Anatolia. Between 1940 and 1800, the city maintained a commercial colony, or Karum, as far away as Kanesh, modern Kiltepe in Cappadocia. Under Shamshi-Adad, its territory extended northward to include the uplands around Nineveh. So its extension westward, as far as the Euphrates, now created a formidable kingdom. From the Mari archive, one learns in great detail how this came to be administered by Shamshi-Adad and his two sons, one of whom, Ishme-Adad, was established as governor of Mari. He preferred to be on the move from one minor city to another, and seems to have spent a good deal of his time at a place called Shubat-Enlil, probably on the river Kaba, and now equated by some scholars with the site called Chagar Bazaar, where Malawan came upon tablets dealing with his financial affairs. Other contemporary letters in which the Assyrian royal family is mentioned have been found more recently at Tell Asmar, the site of a provincial capital in the Sinjar area. The combined contents of all these texts have helped to create an extremely clear and sometimes entertaining picture of public administration and personal relations between the ruling families. For this reason alone, they are invaluable documents. The end of Shamshi-Adad's reign is less straightforward to reconstruct. After Eshnunna and Elam overran his southern garrisons, they drove westward to the Euphrates, and the Assyrian king may have died resisting them. When the situation again became clear, Ishme-Adad succeeded him as king of Ashur, 1781 BC. But Mari had regained its independence and was ruled by Iach-dun-lim's son, Zimri-lim, who had been exiled to Aleppo. Zimri-lim made the final improvements to the palace, which Parrott excavated. Zimri-lim's political relations with the south, dependent on ephemeral alliances with Babylon and Eshnunna, were satisfactory for the time being. Syrian states such as Akkad, of which Aleppo was a principal city, Al-Alak, and even Katna in the plain of Homs, remained friendly in the northwest. Only to the east of the Euphrates at this time, 1800 BC, the country had begun to be disturbed by the arrival of new immigrants. These were the Hurrians, a people of unknown extraction, neither Semites nor Indo-Europeans. Since the third dynasty of Ur, small centers in northern Mesopotamia had rulers with Hurrian names. In Zimri-lim's time, they were already to be found at Carchemish, and later as far afield as Al-Alak and the Orontes Valley. However, our limited understanding of them primarily stems from the American excavations at Nuzi, near Kirkuk. Despite their temporary disunity, the Hurrians posed no significant threat to the cities of Upper Mesopotamia. In the end, the accession of a great statesman to the throne of Babylon ended this peaceful interlude. In 759 BC, the armies of Hammurabi defeated a coalition consisting of Lhasa, Eshnunna, Elam, and Mari. 2 years later, the armies of Hammurabi completely destroyed Mari's revolt, and Assyria, now significantly smaller, became a vassal of Babylon. As in Sargon of Akkad, the whole country was again united under a single ruler, and an appropriate administration system was devised. Hammurabi's achievements in this respect are reflected in his famous law code, which is inscribed on a 3-meter-high basalt stela in the Louvre. During the reigns of Hammurabi's successors, 3 unexpected developments foreshadowed the disintegration of his empire. In the south, people inhabit the so-called Sea Land at the head of the Arabian Gulf, encroaching upon the old Sumerian cities and creating a new kingdom from them. Secondly, a host of Kassites came from the northeast and were displaced from their homeland by the same movement of Indo-European peoples that brought the Hittites into Anatolia. And finally, in 1595 BC, the Hittites themselves, under their king Mercilus III, after sacking in turn Carchemish and Mari, swept on down the Euphrates as far as Babylon itself, which they plundered and burnt, thereby putting an end to Hammurabi's dynasty. The Hittite raid on Babylon was one of the strange phenomena of Near Eastern history, for Mercilus was almost immediately summoned home to deal with enemies threatening his own capital in Anatolia. Consequently, the Kassites reaped the greatest benefits as they peacefully assumed control of Babylonia. They adopted the religion and culture of Mesopotamia so thoroughly and unquestionably that, for the next 360 years, one would hardly be aware that much of that country was now being ruled by a dynasty of completely alien kings. To the north, meanwhile, in the hilly country beyond Nineveh and west to the Euphrates, much the same situation had arisen regarding the Hurrians. Such rulers as they possessed had now been replaced by a new Indo-European aristocracy, whose political acumen finally enabled them to acquire a national identity for their people. Between Assyria and the Hittites emerged a powerful kingdom, thereafter known as Mitanni, with its capital at Washshukani, a site to the west of Nisibin that has not yet been located. In the early years of the 14th century, one finds its kings corresponding almost on equal terms with Egyptian pharaohs of the 18th dynasty. During this century, Assyria, still with its capital at Ashur, began to reappear as a major power. As one able ruler followed another, its southern frontier was stabilized, while the Mitannians, under pressure from the Hittites, soon began to relax their hold on northern Mesopotamia. Finally, weakened by internal disputes, their royal family lost authority, and its army ceased to be a match for that of Assyria. In 1250 BC, after several defeats, the last Mitannian king was slain by Shalmaneser I, and his country became a province of the Assyrian state. Shalmaneser's successor, Tukulti-Ninurta I, 1244 to 1208, conquered Babylon, and during the remainder of the second millennium, one watches the earlier stages in the creation of an Assyrian empire. With these historical events in mind, it is easier to understand that the archaeology of the second millennium can be divided into 4 principal phases, each of which is illustrated by the results of at least one major excavation. To begin with, there is the Isin-Larsa period, 2020 to 1763 BC, ending with Hammurabi's unification of Mesopotamia. This period is well represented at the Diyala sites: Tell Asmar, Eshnunna, Ishali, Neribtum, and Tel Hamal, Shadupum. Next are the reigns of Hammurabi and his successors, the Old Babylonian period, ending with the fall of Babylon in 1595 BC. For this, we have Parrot's wonderfully comprehensive finds at Mari. Thirdly, the Iraq government's excavations at Dur-Kurigalzu, Akar-Kuf, primarily documented the time of the Kassite dynasty, 1595 to 1235 BC in the south, This partly coincides with a period of Hurrian-Mitannian domination in the north, of which we shall find evidence at Nutsi and elsewhere. And finally, there is the growth of Assyrian power, the so-called Middle Assyrian period, which will bring us to recall the excavations made by the Germans at Ashur itself. Buildings of the Lysin-Larsa period. Eshnunna ceased to be a vassal of Ur in 2027 BC, and some years later its first independent governor, Ilushwilia, added a palace to the massive temple, which one of his predecessors had dedicated to Shu-Sin, a deified king of Ur. In 1996, he annexed a smaller religious building to the palace, probably now dedicated to the local god, Tishpak. Like the older temple, this palace chapel adheres to the plan, now uniformly adopted in Babylonia, with entry, courtyard, antecella, and sanctuary all on the same axis. The palace is of great interest because it is located in a long line of secular buildings planned for the same purpose. 97 facing, the square court is a broad rectangular throne room or audience chamber with a staircase leading to the flat roof near one end. Smaller chambers divide it from a great hall, also known as the Bitanu Court, which could host assemblies. We shall see something similar at Mari and, more than 1,000 years on, in the standard reception suites of the late Assyrian palaces. In the Eshnunna Palace, remnants of the state archive were found in the stairwell. But some of the most important historical evidence was derived from the stamped bricks used during each successive reconstruction of the building, which provided a complete genealogy of local rulers. We learn in this way that a later governor, Ibikadad II, enlarger of Eshnunna, built an immensely greater palace facing the earlier buildings across a broad street. Only the foundations have survived. They may have remained unfinished. Yet again, one may recognize the standard arrangement of the court, throne room, and great hall, which is now much enlarged and duplicated. Elsewhere to the north, Ibikadad's son, confusingly called Naram Sin, built a separate audience hall, in this case differently planned, supposedly because he had assumed the prerogatives of divinity. Nearer to the river Diyala is Ishali, ancient Neribtum, where, in the year Rapik was sacked, Ibikadad built a temple, perhaps the finest monument of the Lysin-Larsa period. The building is a precise rectangle, measuring approximately 100 by 60 meters, and incorporates 3 separate shrines, the largest dedicated to Ishtar Kititum, a local form of the powerful goddess. The whole complex is raised 3 meters above ground level on a platform, or kisu, faced with kiln-baked bricks set in bitumen. Baked brick is again generously used elsewhere, for instance, in constructing a wide stairway leading from the outer courtyard to that of the major shrine, which stands at an even higher level, and for the 3 towered gateways. An unusual feature is to be seen in one of the subsidiary shrines, whose sanctuary is set lengthwise on the main axis, a practice later adopted in Assyrian temples, German Langram. Elsewhere, the Breitram arrangement remains intact. A much-published drawing by the late Harold Hill shows a striking reconstruction of the entire building. It makes an intriguing contrast to Shadupum, Tell Asmar, a small, outlying, heavily fortified administrative station on the outskirts of modern Baghdad. But it too was provided with no less than 4 comparatively modest temples, the largest of which has outer and inner gateways, flanked by the almost life-size figures of lions in terracotta. Archives of tablets found in its administrative buildings included, among other important texts, a code of laws preceding that of Hammurabi. Under this heading, we should discuss ordinary dwelling houses from the Larsa period in detail. These are well represented in contemporary levels at the Diyala sites, but perhaps even better illustrated at Ur by Woolley's excavation in a residential area southeast of the temple precinct. There was a tangle of narrow streets with modest houses on either side, and occasionally small religious shrines occupied their own sites at an important crossroads where several lanes met. The houses themselves so closely resembled those of any small town in Iraq early in the present century that they hardly merit description. Blank walls facing the street, rooms in 2 stories opening, onto an unroofed central court, and in one of which Woolley drew a well-known reconstruction, a sheltered wooden gallery at first-floor level supported on posts. 202 among their few distinctive features were the graves of their occupants, often buried beneath the ground-floor pavements. The palace at Mari. The Mari Palace had doubtless been the residence of Zimrilim's father, Iaqdunlim, and afterward used by Shamshi-Adad's son during the Assyrian interlude. But, as much of it was built of bricks, stamped with the name Zimri-Lim, he must have considerably enlarged and rebuilt it. We know the final destruction occurred when the city walls collapsed in the 35th year of Hammurabi, 1757 BC. Nevertheless, when Parrot found it, its 4-meter thick walls remained standing in some cases as much as 5 meters high, and the lintels of some doorways were still intact. 203. The whole building measures approximately 200 by 120 meters, twice the dimensions of the Ishtar Kittitum temple. Much of the plan is made up of multiple copies of what is actually a Babylonian dwelling house unit, a group of rooms arranged around an open court. However, these are only minor parts of the main system, comprising reception rooms and religious shrines. From the main entrance with its guard rooms, one passes into a huge outer courtyard, A, of which the main feature is a 3-audience chamber, approached by a flight of steps, B, thought by some to be a surviving feature of an earlier building. But it is the inner, slightly smaller courtyard, C, on which the main suite of reception chambers faces. It comprises the now traditional elements. First, a throne room, D, with a podmom facing the central doorway. And then, separated from it by vestibules, a larger element corresponding to the Great Hall, E. But the latter now has a clearly religious function. At one end, steps lead up to a sanctuary, and a throne emplacement is facing it at the opposite end of the hall. As Parrot has observed, this gives the whole central suite a non-secular character, and we shall see that this is borne out by the relics of sculpture and mural paintings associated with it. More simply decorated are the living apartments of the royal family in the northwest corner of the building, whose outer walls on both sides are enormously strengthened. The king's own chamber and that of the queen were recognizable, and in the court between, some game had been marked out on the pavement. Closer than one would expect to this domestic unit were 2 chambers with rows of clay benches, identified as a school or offices for scribes. 2 storerooms, originally arranged on shelves, provided access to the archives. The third and most important archive room was conveniently located between the inner and outer courts. Other storage rooms could be seen elsewhere, besides the 200 or more rooms grouped around the central unit. For example, one group was centered around a room that the archaeologists called the Cercle des Officiers, because of the painted walls that made it stand out. Also near the southeast corner of the building were 2 rooms composing a minor shrine, connected in a processional way to the main audience hall. We need to discuss the mural paintings further, as they have been the focus of extensive specialized research. 204. According to Parrot, these artifacts are very important because they clearly show the spirit of synthesis which animated the artists of the Middle Euphrates at this period. This spirit was a strange mix of Sumerian erraticism from a previous age and the unique naturalism of the Semitic approach to art. As he says, these influences seem to have contributed to creating a new school of decoration, which, had it been given time to mature, might have produced one of the high artistic epochs of Near Eastern history. The murals were painted directly upon a thin layer of mud plaster, in a manner that has been taken to suggest that the true fresco technique was understood. The largest and most ambitious composition, L'Investiture du Roi de Mari, was still in place on an outer wall adjoining the central entrance to the throne room in a part of the courtyard. C, which was protected from the weather by a roof or awning supported on posts. Upper and lower panels compose the central design. In the former, the king, draped in an elaborately fringed costume and polo headdress, receives or touches a divine emblem held by the goddess Ishtar, whose raised foot rests upon the back of a lion. Other gods and goddesses are in attendance. In the lower scene, facing each other, are two identical figures of the goddess with a flowing vase, wearing a flounced dress and holding an aribalos vessel, from which streams of water, full of fish, undulate around the picture. Both scenes are framed on either side by tall panels with palm and other stylized trees, among which birds, mythical animals, and divinities are to be seen. One scholar has ingeniously explained this composition as a ceremony in a temple's ante-cella, which in later Assyrian times was entered between flowing vases and artificial palms. Whatever the case, such a design's ornamental border and bright colors must have been stunning. Another such painting adorned a wall of the audience chamber in the outer courtyard, which may be slightly earlier. Known to the excavators as Le Sacrifice de l'eau by du feu, it is a scene of worship and libation, attended by monstrous figures of Sumerian mythology. Tiamat of the Enuma Elish epic and Shamash, rising behind his mountain to scatter the stars. The king, Shamshi-Adad I, again in his fringed garment, also appears in the surviving fragment of a sacrificial scene, whose original position in the building could not be positively determined. We have noted above that in the center of the city at the southeast approach to the palace, a cluster of minor temples had already existed in early dynastic times, dedicated to such gods as Ninhursag or more local deities like Ishtarat and Nini Zaza. Some of these still survived in the 8th century, but they were now dwarfed in size by the temple of Dagan, a grain god worshipped along the middle Euphrates, whose sanctuary, a small ziggurat, was at some time annexed. Dedicatory tablets showed that this temple was in fact built by Ishtop-Ilium, a governor of the city in the late Lhasa period, circa 890 BC, of whom a fine portrait statue was found. Not in the temple, but in the great sanctuary of Zimrilim's palace. Therefore, we can discuss this and other Mari statues with the combined products of the Isin Lhasa and Old Babylonian periods. Tel Rima. We found little information about the facade ornament and roofing method of the buildings we referred to during their excavation. In the 1960s, a British expedition led by David Oates, who worked at Tel Rima in the Sinjar district west of Mosul, shed much new light on both. Here, where a largish mound already covered the remains of earlier settlements, a local ruler in the time of Shamshi-Adad had built himself a city, surrounding it with fortifications and creating from the mound itself an emplacement for a remarkably fine temple. As described by the excavator himself, this building was approached by a freestanding staircase carried on vaults, and from its roof, further stairs or ramps led to a high terrace, perhaps surmounted by a higher shrine. The whole 3- or 4-tiered structure must have resembled a ziggurat. The temple itself, on its platform high above the city, was laid out on the Babylonian plan and decorated in a style with southern parallels, although it is unique as a complete system of ornament. All the external and courtyard facades were adorned with engaged columns, set singly or in groups. The 50 large columns were built of carved bricks, laid in complicated patterns to represent spirals or palm trunks. However, the more extraordinary feature of this building was the prevailing use of mud brick arches and vaulting, even for trivial purposes, where wood could have been substituted. 209. Complicated vaulting systems, including the use of pitched brick construction and even pendentives, were contrived with such casual facilities that a long and widespread tradition of building in this manner seemed to be implied. Sculpture. Of the Mari statues, the only one undoubtedly contemporary with the palace is the flowing vase goddess, fragments of which were found both in the throne room and the courtyard outside. This must have been a fixture since, by an arrangement of pipes, it actually dispensed water. Stylistically, however, it is of little significance since its design, in most respects, suggests a traditional treatment of this particular subject. More characteristic are the several statues of local princes. Ishtopileum, found in the Great Sanctuary, Idealeum from the southeast shrine, and Puzur Ishtar, which was part of a collection of antiquities assembled by a late Babylonian king, and now in the Istanbul Museum. These compare interestingly with the statues of two Eshnunna governors, one seated and carrying a booty to Susa. In a world where the crudity of the Kaunakis was hardly remembered, these statues are dressed in a toga-like garment, whose fine texture and restrained modelling are effectively contrasted with the obtrusive detail of ornamental fringes and the pattern of formally dressed beards. They are by no means lacking in dignity. Other sculptures of the period are scarce and often of poor quality. Where relief carving is concerned, the scene depicted at the head of Hammurabi's law code stela is unique. The king, whose profile and headdress are familiar from fragmentary sculptures in the round, stands facing a seated god with the emblem of divinity, Gustus, in his hand, like Ishtar in the investiture painting. In the words of Henri Frankfurt, the scene conveys not only a sense of confrontation but also of communication between the Lord of Justice and the lawgiver. But there is another form of relief, modelled in terracotta. A fine example is the privately owned panel showing the naked goddess, Lilith, with her supporting lions and owls. More common still are votive plaques of baked clay cast in an open mould, which were probably sold to worshippers at a temple. Their subjects vary from the ubiquitous mother goddess, now grotesquely conventionalized, to sensitively modelled figures of musicians, temple women, or more trivial motifs, such as a bitch suckling her puppies, corresponding to the fine terracotta lions from the temple gateways at Tell Asmar, similar beasts of bronze, with inlaid eyes, guarded the sanctuary of the Dagon temple at Mari. The Kassites. Because the Kassites ruled Babylonia for more than 4 centuries, it is surprising to observe how little their national characteristics are reflected in the material remains of their occupation. These make it abundantly clear that in religion, administration, and technical practices, they adopted and faithfully maintained the age-old conventions of Mesopotamia, rebuilding temples and honoring the shrines of Sumerian deities. At first glance, the Temple of Karandash at Uruk stands out from the surrounding buildings, due to its exaggerated corner buttresses. Even so, its elaborately decorated facade embodies one motif with which we are already familiar. Tall niches between its projecting pilasters are filled with the alternating figures of Babylonian gods and goddesses, holding the traditional flowing vase in both hands. For the rest, they provide us with a very early example of the molded brick, perfected by Assyrian and Neo-Babylonian craftsmen. The grandiose new capital, which was founded by the Kassites themselves and called Dur-Kurigalzu, is distinguished from other Babylonian cities only by the nature of its chosen site. It was built upon a low outcrop of soft limestone at the northern extremity of the alluvial plain to the west of modern Baghdad, where the eroded core of its great ziggurat, now partially restored, still creates a conspicuous landmark. Iraqi government excavations in 1942-5 exposed a complex of temples at the foot of the tower, and further out on a peninsula extending into the neighboring flood basin, the remains of at least 4 palaces. Peculiar features of the temple area were rectangular platforms faced with baked brick, supporting the principal shrines. Most of the inscriptions on the pivot stones and tablets found in this area were from the time of a king named Kurigalzu. However, the way the palaces were built and the fact that they were rebuilt more often than others suggested that there had been at least one king with the same name before Kurigalzu. One of these palaces, H, unfortunately in part denuded owing to the weathering of the mound, did show some signs of an architectural arrangement perhaps characteristically Kassite. Multiple doorways surrounded the central courtyard, leading to long galleries reminiscent of cloisters. Mural paintings depicting court officials' processions adorned the reveals of these doorways, reaching a height of approximately 1 meter. They wore a short-sleeved garment with a fringed girdle and a fez-shaped headdress over their long hair in the Assyrian manner. It has been suggested that this figured ornament, forming a dado at the base of the walls, foreshadowed the use of sculptured slabs for the same purpose in later Assyrian palaces. In Kassite times, relief sculpture was mainly restricted to boundary stones, kuduru, bearing the emblems of gods invoked as witnesses of a land settlement, or a king who had authorized it. Another palace of a much earlier period had one long gallery painted white, with triple rows of small plastered pedestals. The many fragments of gold leaf and other valuables lying on the pavement strongly suggested its use as a treasure chamber. Later, a range of brick-vaulted repositories replaced it, likely intended for the same purpose. Someone may have looted the palace and scattered other valuable objects here and in the stairwells leading to the roof. Amidst numerous damaged gold ornaments and beads, we discovered an intact gold bracelet featuring granular ornamentation interspersed with blue paste inlays. We also found numerous mosaic ornament fragments in colored glass. This would be contemporary with or older than the 18th dynasty Egyptian glass found at Tell Asmar. The craftsmanship of that period in Egypt was also recalled by the painted head of a man with a full beard in terracotta and the equally well-modelled lioness figure. Mitanni. We now have to deal with the Mitannian occupation of northern Mesopotamia, partly contemporary with the Kassite dynasty in Babylonia. Mitannian kings reigned from their capital at Washukani, near the headwaters of the river Kabur, from about 1500 BC until the mid-14th century, when their kingdom disintegrated. During that time, one of their southernmost strongholds was the city now known as Nuzi, 12.5 miles to the southwest of modern Kirkuk, Arafa. And its site was excavated by Americans from Pennsylvania under RFS Starr and others during the late 1920s and early 1930s. To anyone seeking the criteria of Mitannian culture, the results of this excavation are both rewarding and disappointing. The excavation revealed a palace, a temple, and numerous significant private dwellings. In the absence of conspicuous works of art, innumerable small finds give an impression of a people whose way of life was much enriched by trade and familiarity with the countries of the Levant and even with Egypt. But undoubtedly, the major discovery of the expedition was an abundance of tablets. Over 5,000 texts in all, including, in certain cases, the entire archives of a single family over periods of as much as 5 generations. The main mound was called Yorgan Tepe, and beneath it lay the actual walled city with its palace and temple. But there were also outlying mounds covering the remains of other palatial residences. Some references have already been made to the temple, since it was originally founded in the early dynastic period, when the place was known as Gassur. It was finally rebuilt in Mitannian times, comprising 2 sanctuaries, and its remains were conveniently dated by a letter from the Mitannian king Shaushatar, 1460 BC. One shrine had internal walls with wooden paneling and clapperboards pegged to the brickwork. Elsewhere, the wall faces were decorated with nail-shaped bosses of glazed terracotta, suspended from these, and some woven fabric enriched with beads. Brightly coloured glazing, common in Egypt then, was also applied to other objects, such as small guardian figures of lions and, in one case, to a wall ornament in the form of a boar's head. As for sculpture, the excavators had to be content with the eye inlay of a life-size statue. The palace was built around the usual broad open courtyards. In the largest of these, at the approach to the main reception suite, the walls seem to have had some painted wooden entablature beneath the eaves. And, before the main entrance to the throne room, a pair of freestanding brick piers may have supported a portico or ornamental baldachin. Everywhere, there were elaborate provisions for drainage and sanitation, including at least one example of a toilet flushed with piped water from above. A luxurious bathroom and lavatory were annexed to the royal apartments, and the vestibule through which these were approached was decorated with impressive mural paintings, incorporating foreign motifs such as guilloche ornament, acroteria, bucrania, and hath or heads. Main doorways had pivot stones, in one of which the bronze shoe of the door, pivot itself, remained in place. The great thickness of the walls in the principal reception units could have implied an increase in their height to allow for clerestory lighting. But the excavators preferred to see this as a mere provision for security. Several mansions in the northern suburb, including that of the Crown Prince, governor of the city of Arafah, were the subject of special study. Those of two brothers, Tehip and Shurki Tilla, produced 1,000 tablets between them. That of an individual called Ziggy contained a formidable collection of copper objects, comprising arrowheads, spearheads, knives, and much laminated armor plating, fused into heavy masses. However, the collection also included tools and weapons, such as scythes, punches, chisels, and adzes, all seemingly abandoned during the fire that destroyed the buildings. Among the minor finds made in these palace buildings at Nutsi, one distinctive feature was an unusual type of pottery. White paint designs elegantly adorned these finely crafted vessels against a dark-coloured background. The most common form was a tall cup with a button base. The patterns, usually in horizontal registers, included motifs now unfamiliar in Mesopotamia, such as running spirals, guilloches, rosettes, and formalized birds and plants. This pottery has been found as far south as Dur-Kuri-Galzu, the capital of the Kassites, and as far north as Tel Bila, which is north of Mosul. However, it is most common in places like Tell Asmar, Al-Alaq, in northern Syria. Woolley thought it came from Crete, but he may have been wrong. Cylinder seals have more in common with northern Syria and Cappadocia. The designs are often overcrowded and confused, but certain motifs, such as the stylized sacred tree and the winged griffin, survived in the imagery of later Assyrian ornaments. Ornaments. Finally, there is the famous collection of texts from Nuzi. Almost all of the 4,000 cuneiform tablets discovered during the excavations were located in the house of Tehip Tilla. Their contents create an extraordinarily detailed picture of daily life in this part-Hurrian community of citizens. Legal and commercial transactions, which they often record, are of interest in themselves. Still, their incidental references to people, places, and things promote one's understanding of the social or environmental background against which they were written, and amplify the evidence provided by archaeological finds. The 2nd millennium BC. In an appendix to R.F.S. Starr's publication of the Nutsi excavation, 1939, E.R. Lackerman summarizes the evidence of material culture to be derived from the texts most interestingly. A most welcome addition to an archaeological report. It appears under headings whose variety alone prepares one for the wealth of information they contain. Nutsi first appears as a walled city with named towers, bastions, and gates. The palace is a massive complex of buildings with annexes that serve many purposes and have a long architectural history. The temple known to the excavators was one of several shrines, piously served by the leading families with suitable offerings and the gift of enslaved people. Accounts of the building or repair of private houses provide a glossary of architectural terms and structural details. Streets are frequently mentioned by name, and the topographical picture is supplemented by much detailed reference to water distribution. A small river serving a network of canals, reservoirs, and bridges, each of them carefully named. Other landmarks were real estate deals and the transfer of land ownership, revealing specifics about farming in a well-irrigated province surrounded by uncultivated steppeland. People commonly use a specific set of words for these types of transactions. For purposes. One learns the relative popularity of various crops, of which barley is once more the most common, followed by wheat, emmer, poppy, and flax. In a separate category are orchards and gardens, from which fruit, vegetables, and flowers are listed by name in careful inventories, and the wood of fruit trees is recommended for specified purposes. Much information on a more technical character is provided under further headings, such as chariots and wagons, furniture, or clothing, and a section on tools, weapons, and armor. In the catalogue of subjects dealt with by the Nutsi texts, one regrets the paucity of references to political subjects and contemporary history. Indeed, the only piece of inscriptional evidence by which the Nutsi culture can be positively dated is, as we have said, a document from a room in the enormous house. Shilwi Teshup, a well-known letter from Shaushatar, king of Mitanni, who ruled in the latter part of the 15th century BC, the Middle Assyrian period. Because of our knowledge of Assyrian archaeology during this period, we are indebted almost exclusively to the work of the German excavators at Ashur, Kalat Sharkat, on the Tigris. The decision to embark on this major enterprise was made in 1903, when in the south, Robert Koldewey's expedition had already spent 4 years wrestling with the problems presented by the enormous ruin fields of Babylon. By then, they had greatly elucidated the site plan, identified most of the principal buildings, and were assured of success in their efforts to resurrect the remains of Nebuchadnezzar's capital city. Only that year it became evident that the unexpectedly high level of the subsoil water table was likely to preclude the investigation of any occupation level earlier than the 7th century BCA supplementary operation was therefore suggested at a site where such remains might be more accessible. And when Ashur was chosen, it was Walter André who was entrusted with the new undertaking. From then until R9, R39, R3, the two excavations continued simultaneously at sites 350 miles apart. The general public has since recognized their accomplishment in recovering historical information and perfecting the archaeological method. City of Ashur. We have already mentioned the situation of Ashur, an outcrop of limestone rising to a considerable height in the angle formed by two courses of the river Tigris. This gave the city natural protection on two sides, and on the landward side. Its defences were completed by a crescent-shaped array of powerful walls, enclosing an area 3/4 of a mile wide. André's principal temples and palaces were in the elevated north and northwest, where primary excavations were conducted. This was so by the now standardized German method of cutting search trenches, such as Graben at room intervals corresponding to the grid lines of his initials simultaneously. He traced the entire circuit of the fortifications, revealing the principal gates, riverside quays, and other features. His deepest penetration was the sounding, which revealed the pre-Sargonid foundation of the Ishtar temple. The latest architectural remains he encountered could be dated to the final phase of the Parthian period, about AD 256. André and Koldewey were both architects, and at Babylon, their tendency to overcorrect the evident faults of earlier excavators resulted in their concentrating on the study of buildings rather than written texts. At Ashur, the function of André's epigraphical advisors became important for reasons that soon became obvious. Over some 2,000 years, successive kings had contributed to restoring and multiplying public buildings or fortifications. The chronological sequence of their building levels could only be determined with the help of associated inscriptions. These showed that many of them had continued to be rebuilt by late Assyrian kings, long after the city had ceased to be their administrative capital. The following paragraphs will explain the mention of royal names belonging more correctly to a later chapter. The landward rampart of the inner city was built and rebuilt by several kings, including Shamshi-Adad I in Hammurabi's time. Tukulti-Ninurta I, R244 to R208 BC, provided it with an external moat 20 meters wide. A foundation inscription also records that Shalmaneser III, 858 to 824 BC, completely reconstructed it, adding an outer wall that ran parallel to it, but was diverted at its southern end to enclose an extension of the city. Meanwhile, in about 300 BC, Adad-nirari had constructed a massive quay of baked brick along the eastern riverfront, and this had been strengthened by several later kings as a secondary protection against flooding. A description approaching the city by river from the north. Its massed buildings must have created an impressive silhouette, as one realizes from a well-known reconstruction drawn by André himself. The temples rose to a maximum height on the northernmost shoulder of the rock, and there were 3 ziggurats. The greatest of these, which had been given its final form by Shamshi-Adad I, measured 60 square meters and was originally dedicated to the Sumerian god Enlil, who was later replaced as a patron of Assyria by the city god Ashur himself. In its exposed position, the tower was much denuded by weather, and nothing remained of its stairways or auxiliary buildings. Out of 38 temples mentioned in the inscriptions, only 4 were fully excavated, the largest of which was again dedicated by Shamshi-Adad to Ashur, and occupied the most prominent position on the northern height, with an enclosed precinct extending southward. Here, as in the later rebuildings of the old Ishtar temple, something is to be learned about the changing conventions that dictated the planning of sacred buildings. As built by Shamshi-Adad, the Ashur temple seemed to have 2 main sanctuaries, one at least conforming to the Breitram arrangement currently adopted in Babylonia. Many centuries later, Sennacherib added to it an eastern annex, with its cella set lengthwise on the main axis in the Assyrian manner. As for the Ishtar temple, the Germans found traces of no less than 6 rebuildings after the destruction of the archaic shrine, in which even its dedication was changed. Yet, always annexed to it, was a small secondary shrine, where Ishtar continued to be worshipped and retained the old Langraum cella, with its bent axis approach following the Sumerian tradition. Of the 2 other principal temples, both had dual dedications and unusual plans. One was the Anu-Adad shrine, with its twin ziggurats, identical Teef temple units in the Assyrian manner, and an enclosed forecourt, contrived as a single architectural composition. The second double temple, dedicated to the moon and sun gods, Sin and Shamash, was first built by Ahur-Nigari I, circa 1500 to 128 BC, but rebuilt to a different plan by Sennacherib. Both have twin Assyrian sanctuaries, approached through Breitram anticellas. A 5th cult building, hardly to be regarded as a temple, was known in Assyrian as the Bit Akitu, to which the cult statues were brought in procession during the New Year's festival. It was located 400 meters outside the city to the northwest, and consisted of a massive square courtyard with lateral colonnades, and a sanctuary on the main axis, resembling a throne room. A further word should be said about the Akitu, or New Year's festival, which acquired its complete ceremonial form during the early centuries of the first millennium BC. By then, it had replaced or assimilated the earlier Sumerian spring festival, associated with the sacred marriage of god and goddess, symbolizing the recurrent cycle of creation and fertility. The feast now took place at the time of the spring equinox and lasted 11 days. each day marking a stage in a prolonged and complicated ritual performance. For the culminating phases of this ceremony, the Bitakitu, or festival house, provided a setting. Thither the statues of the gods were escorted, mounted on wagons or boats, or temporarily removed from their temples to be present at the celebration of a rite known as the Fixing of Destinies, in which the king played a leading role. Many details of the ritual used on these occasions are known from surviving texts. At Asher, the paved way along which the procession passed out of the city was revealed by excavation. The secular buildings at Asher bear little comparison to the temples. The so-called Old Palace, sited next to the main ziggurat, embodies a labyrinth of rectangular chambers and ranges of storerooms, entered and lit from a succession of open courtyards. In this way it resembles the palaces of the Lhasa period at Eshnunna, with its original foundation being contemporary. Occasionally similar to the palaces of Mari and Ur, the Asher Palace incorporates private religious shrines. The Asher Palace was still in use at the time of Tiglath-Pileser, but during the late Assyrian period, what remained of it seems to have been converted into a mausoleum. Ashurnasirpal, 883 to 859 BC, embellished one of its gateways with winged bull sculptures and constructed elegant tomb chambers beneath it. The Germans found these to contain huge monolithic sarcophagi, looted in antiquity but still bearing the names, among others, of Ashurnasirpal himself, and of Shamshi-Adad Fi, 823 to 811 BC. Meanwhile, on an artificial terrace at the northwest angle of the city wall, Tukulti-Ninurta I, after his conquest of Babylon, built a new palace of which only the stone foundations remained. Not content with this, he also provided himself with a new residential suburb, 8 miles north of the city, on the left bank of the Tigris, and named it Ka Tukulti Ninurta. He also built a miniature ziggurat and beside it a temple with a Babylonian sanctuary and a cult niche penetrating the tower's facade. Andrei believed constructing a bridge over the street behind the ziggurat would provide access to its upper terraces. For the rest, some of the most interesting discoveries at Ka Tukulti Ninurta were examples of figured ornament in the colored glaze on terracotta, sometimes in the form of upright wall slabs, orthostats, and a panel built up out of polychrome glazed bricks. We should examine some of the Asher finds and their features as Assyrian ideas or innovations. In a study of this subject, Henry Frankfort claims that in the 14th century, an art emerged that, for all its derivations, possessed an individual character, not only in style but also in subject matter. It depicted secular subjects interested in reality, for which no incident seemed too trivial. On the other hand, religious matters displayed a cold formalism, which did not allow a man to meet the gods face to face, but only to perform the established rites before their statues and emblems. A frequently quoted example of this last tendency is the carved relief on an altar set up by Tukulti-Ninurta III. Here is a direct contrast if one remembers the direct confrontation between man and God in the scene carved on Hammurabi's famous Stela. The Assyrian king is seen to approach and then kneel before an altar similar to that on which the picture is carved, and it is surmounted, not by a statue, but by the traditional symbol of a particular god, in this case Nusku, one of the 3 fire gods manifest in the sacrificial flame. Perhaps this attitude to divinity is equally reflected in the planning of Assyrian temples described earlier, where the cult statue is withdrawn to the furthest extremity of an elongated sanctuary. As for the god Asher himself, he too appears more often as a symbol than in human form. His figure requires wings, like the sun disk of Egyptian Horus, and the disk has a bird's tail. Another contemporary development is the carving of cylinder seals, which now demonstrate a renewed interest in design. During the Lhasa and Old Babylonian periods, the monotony of presentation scenes often necessitated the addition of an inscription with the owner's name. Distinctive compositions in tabloid form replaced this convention. While some traditional combat scenes exist, many new subjects exist. A king hunts ostriches. A winged horse protects its foal from a lion or stag's graze. Our earlier account of buildings at Ashur was, for obvious reasons, largely confined to variations in their ground plans. Contemporary seal designs occasionally provide clues about facade ornament and external appearance. This applies particularly to the parapet treatment of buildings, whether religious or secular. We suspect that crenellations were introduced at about this time from Egypt, and one 13th century seal from Ashur shows a double fortress wall, its parapet crenellated with round-headed merlins. Two other seals from the same site, dated perhaps 100 years later, show for the first time merlins in the stepped form familiar today. One of these is of special interest. First, because the symbol of the dog deity, Gula, proves the building to be a temple rather than a fortress, which means that the crenellations are ornamental. Secondly, it shows architectural details, such as towers rising above the tops of the walls, doorways, and rectangular panels, which might be windows. Finally, in seals of this period, genii known as Apkallu sometimes appear, hybrid creatures with two pairs of wings, winged and hawk-headed monsters, or bearded men sheathed in fish skins. But these are to be seen more frequently in the form of terracotta plaques or figurines, which are sometimes found buried beneath the floors of houses for apotropaic purposes. They too take their place in the imagery of later Assyrian times. The late Assyrian period. Early in the 10th century at Ashur, a new dynasty was founded by a king called Ashur-Rabi II, and this marked the beginning of an important epoch in Mesopotamian history. The reign of his grandson, Adad-nirari II, 91 to 891 BC, saw the earliest stage in the revival of economic stability and military initiative, eventually leading to the creation of an Assyrian empire. Adad-nirari's first concern was to establish once and for all the essential frontiers of his kingdom. And this he accomplished through a series of successful campaigns and political maneuvers. Cities like Arafah, Kirkuk in the east, and Guzan, Tel Halat, on the headwaters of the Kabur in the north, became strong points in a new defensive system, while small Aramaean principalities on the middle course of the Euphrates were annexed to protect his trade connections with Syria. At an early stage in these operations, Assyria's southern frontier with Babylon was fixed by a treaty, the text of which has been preserved in a rather famous inscription known as the Synchronous History. This document conveniently incorporates a chronological account of all previous border disputes between the two states. It may also correspond with the beginning of accurately dated history, since we now have supplementary evidence of the so-called Limmu lists. These lists record the names of particular officials appointed annually to preside over the New Year's festival. Since they had come to be used in dating legal agreements and other important documents, their historical significance is obvious. Tukulti-Ninurta II, the successor of Adad-nirari, initiated the extension of his father's frontiers to the north. This action brought him into contact with the Muski, or Phrygians, who had replaced the Hittites on the Anatolian plateau, and the Nairi peoples, who later consolidated into Urartu. After this, he contented himself with an operation later repeated at intervals by most of his successors, a general sweep around the eastern and southern provinces, checking on subject states from whom tribute had not been forthcoming and making an admonitory gesture towards Babylon. On this occasion, he paused to inspect the remnants of the old Kassite capital at Dur-Kurigalzu. But from an archaeological viewpoint, the most important of these first Iron Age kings of Assyria was Ashur-nasirpal, 883 to 859 BC. For it was he who transferred the center of government from Ashur itself to a hitherto less important city at the junction of the Tigris and the Upper Zab. This was Kallu, the Kala of Genesis, now known as Nimrud, which he enlarged and embellished to create a new Assyrian capital. Once this was done, and an improved military headquarters established, he set out on a campaign directed towards the Euphrates crossings in the northwest. Until now, the main barrier to progress in this direction had been a powerful state centered on Tell Asmar, near Carchemish, and its capture opened the way to Aleppo. From there, his armies marched almost unopposed as far as the Mediterranean, and tribute was exacted from the coastal cities. Inaugurated in this way was the long saga of foreign conquest, which, under Ashur-nasirpal's successors, brought Assyrian armies westward as far as Egypt. For the time being, his hold on the Levantine cities at least must have been oppressive. For in the reign of his son, Shalmaneser III, we hear of an anti-Assyrian coalition headed by a prince called Adad-iri of Damascus, who is suspected of having been Ben-Hadad of the Old Testament. This revolt was suppressed, and the inland cities of Syria were brought into subjection, along with Tabal, north of Aleppo, and Quae, in Cilicia. Economically, these conquests must have been enormous to the advantage of Assyria, since they ensured the freedom of trade routes to the west and access to metal sources in the Taurus Mountains. Similarly, in the south, Shalmaneser's suppression of a revolt by Chaldean chieftains against the friendly government in Babylon, celebrated on his throne base at Nimrud, enabled him to maintain contact with traders in the Arabian Gulf, who brought goods from India and Arabia by way of Dilmun, Bahrain. It would be out of place here to further pursue the threads of late Assyrian history in any detail. Of its framework, it may be necessary to recall only those elements that lend coherence to the archaeological record. The 5 reigns that followed that of Shalmaneser III represent a period of comparative inertia, during which imperial aspirations were temporarily in abeyance, and little effort was made to counteract the erosion of newly acquired territories. To the north, in particular, the now powerful kingdom of Urartu, with its system of fortresses in Lake Van, was pursuing a policy of expansion that threatened to deny the Assyrians access to Anatolia. Its territories now extended eastward to the shores of Lake Urmia, and by 745 BC, when Tiglath-Pileser III succeeded to the throne in Kalhu, the Urartian armies were engaged in a westward thrust towards Syria. Firm action was needed, and Tiglath-Pileser proved to be a ruler equal to the occasion. During his reign, Assyria recovered its lost territories and re-established itself as the leading economic and military power in the Near East. Contributions to this revival were successful administrative reforms, in which he reorganized the whole system of government, both in the homeland and the provinces. By establishing posting stages along the main caravan routes, he made these reforms effective, enabling the city's abandonment in 705 BC. His successor, Sennacherib, preferred to adopt the older city of Nineveh as his center of government, thereby profiting from the obvious advantages of its central position on the east bank of the Tigris. And it was there that for the 3rd time in succession, a new and more splendid setting was contrived for the Assyrian court. In a well-known text, Sennacherib reproaches his forebears for having neglected the upkeep of Nineveh. He adds a lengthy and rather detailed account of his own efforts to remedy this situation. And the magnitude of his undertaking is made apparent by the immensely extended area of the city whose ruins can be seen today from the west bank eminences of modern Mosul. Its walls form an irregular rectangle almost 2.5 miles long, and on the side, facing the river, one sees the older mound whose shape and size he adapted to form an emplacement for his palaces and temples. Outside the walls, as we know from the same text, he laid out orchards and plantations with rare trees from distant provinces and added a zoological garden. Not content with the quality of the face near Bavian, its completion was commemorated by rock carvings of the Assyrian gods and inscriptions, to which he added an account of his other political and military accomplishments. Sennacherib presents himself convincingly in these and other texts from his palace at Nineveh as possibly the greatest soldier-statesman since Hammurabi. Only 2 notable figures remain in late Assyrian history. One is Esarhaddon, who succeeded Sennacherib after his eventual murder by members of his own family. He was the one who reached the ultimate goal of his country's imperial ambitions by invading Egypt. During the temporary absence of its Ethiopian ruler, Tarku, or Tirhaka, he besieged and captured Memphis, thereafter adopting the title of the pharaohs, king of Upper and Lower Egypt. At Nineveh he had time to build himself a new administrative palace, where he installed some of the loot from Egypt before receiving the news that Memphis had been retaken by Tarku. He was on his way to deal with this situation when he died. In a document that has survived, Esarhaddon had long ago assured the accession to his son Ashurbanipal's Assyrian throne, and he was now compelled to reconquer Egypt. This time he destroyed Memphis. Ashurbanipal next turned his attention to the southeast frontier, where Elam was in revolt, having formed an alliance with Chaldea. Here too he scored a notable victory, and it was his capture on this occasion of Susa, the Elamite capital, which was commemorated by a well-known relief carving in his palace at Nineveh. 25 years later, the Chaldeans played some part in the events that led to the final destruction of Nineveh. In 614 BC, a Median army under Cyaxares invaded the Assyrian homeland, capturing Nimrud and destroying the more ancient capital at Ashur. This brought them into contact with the Babylonians, and a treaty was signed between Cyaxares and the Chaldean king Nabopolassar. During the following year, the Medes could also enlist the help of Scythian tribes to the north of their realm, and the three peoples made common cause against Nineveh. The city fell after a surprisingly short siege in 612 BC and was largely destroyed. The remnants of the Assyrian court took refuge at Haran on the northwest frontier. Early excavations in Assyrian cities. It seems necessary to present this rather threadbare account of the latest phase in Assyrian dynastic history to clarify the chronology and location of the discoveries we discuss. Contemporary commentary literature and heavy volumes of records show their abundance and variety. The knowledge they have helped us acquire is the most useful. For our present purpose, then, a distinction must first be made. For our current purpose, we must first distinguish between two types of excavation used on the ruins of Assyrian cities. These excavations were very different when they were done and depended on how people today understand what archaeologists were trying to do. Orders in the 19th century aimed to discover and acquire removable antiquities, with little attention to the setting in which they were found. It started in 1842 with Botter's discovery of Khorsabad, followed 2 years later by Layard's first excavations at Nimrud. It lasted with a brief interval during and after the Crimean War, until the death in 1877 of George Smith, who had found and identified the cuneiform version of the Deluge story. Excavations in the second category, of the sort with which we are familiar today, paying proper attention to stratigraphy and environmental evidence, were resumed in 1927, when American archaeologists returned to Khorsabad, and later by British excavators at Nimrud. We won't talk much about the lives and adventures of the first archaeologists here. Instead, we'll admire their hard work and persistence, even when doubters tried to stop them, or people tried to stop them, on purpose. Tyon. Popular reaction to the romantic appeal of their discoveries ultimately rewarded them. They could forget the ill-humoured contention and international rivalry that marred their relations, which later deteriorated into an undignified scramble for archaeological loot. The present writer has recounted their story elsewhere, while French and German scholars have presented it more objectively. The current goal is to examine the sites they dug and identify the monuments or buildings they found after more systematic investigations. Nimrud, Kalhu. At Kalhu, the greatly enlarged city designed by Ashurnasirpal II, 883 to 859 BC, during the early years of his reign, was approximately square in shape with a maximum dimension of almost 1.25 miles. Its site was bounded on the west side by the Tigris and to the south by a canal, into which water was diverted from the Upper Zab River. In the southwest corner, A mound created by the remains of earlier settlements had been reshaped and revetted to form a raised citadel, within which the main palaces and temple buildings could be concentrated. But there was also, in the southeast corner, a walled enclosure containing the imperial arsenal. The citadel mound first attracted Layard's attention when he excavated it in November 1845. As it exists today, partly eroded by rainwater drainage from the summit, one sees the rhomboid of its retaining walls, dominated by the remnants of a small ziggurat in its northwest corner. Dramatically revealed by Layard's first trenches were the walls and sculptures of Ashur-Nasirpal's own official residence, later known as the Northwest Palace. Overlooking the river directly south of the ziggurat, here, in addition to wall reliefs, he exposed for the first time doorways flanked by guardian figures of winged bulls or lions with tall genii behind them. For the time being, his work was confined to chambers around the ceremonial court of the building, and they contained figures of bronze, alabaster vessels, and fallen fragments of mural paintings, which he had no means of conserving. Layard's first work period at Nimrud lasted until 1847, when he located and examined several other buildings. Again on the riverfront was the so-called Western Palace of Adad-nirari III, and a Southwest Palace, built or restored by Esarhaddon, using sculptures intended for a building of Tiglath-Pileser III. The name of this last king was also associated with that of Shalmaneser III on many inscriptions from a central palace. And it was in the environs of this building that Layard came upon the famous Black Obelisk, now in the British Museum, with its scenes of tribute bearers, among whom Jehu, king of Israel, is named. Finally, beneath an eminence in the southeast corner of the mound, he cleared some rooms of a building attributed to a very late Assyrian king called Ashur-Mililani, in which Malowan, over a century later, made important finds. In 1847, with Rawlinson in Baghdad acquiring improved knowledge of cuneiform, Layard was able to satisfy himself that the site he was excavating was Kalhu, rather than Nineveh. Layard returned to Nimrud in 1849 after publishing his book Nineveh and Its Remains, and he brought with him an artist, Cooper, later replaced by Bell, to take over the task of drawing the reliefs, which had been occupying too much of his time. During the following 2 years, he made further finds in the Northwest Palace, including some hundreds of bronze objects with ornaments of ivory and even glass. At the foot of the ziggurat, he also discovered a temple dedicated to Ninurta, with inscribed paving slabs presenting the annals of Ashur-Nasirpal's reign, and in its sanctuary an almost undamaged statue of the same king, which has taken place in the British Museum as a rare example of Assyrian sculpture in the round. But during 1850, as we shall presently see, he began a secondary excavation in the palace mound at Nineveh, where his discovery of Sennacherib's palace brought his archaeological fieldwork to an end. From 1852 to 1854, Layard's work in Assyria was taken over by his assistant Hormuzd Rassam, brother of the locally born British consular representative in Mosul, who, from then onwards, became known for the ruthless pragmatism of his archaeological methods and disregard for the finer points of international ethics. At Nimrud, in the southeast part of the citadel, he located the Nabu temple complex, which was more recently and more methodically excavated by Malowan's expedition. There he found statues, 2 of which were respectively dedicated for the life of Adad-nirari III and of his mother Semiramis. Also a stela of Shamshi-Adad V. But he was by now too preoccupied with excavations at Nineveh to absent himself for long from Mosul. In 1854, Rawlinson entrusted the work at Nimrud to W.K. Loftus, who is better known for his earlier soundings at sites of Sumerian cities in the south. Loftus made one more important find in a building to the west of the Nabu temple, now known as the Burnt Palace. This was a fine group of ivory carvings, which, after a belated study by the British Museum in the 1950s, made possible the first stylistic analysis of craftsmanship in this medium. Khorsabad. Paul-Émile Botta became the French consul in Mosul 3 years before Layard discovered Nimrud. Ready in 1842, he had started without much success to make soundings in the Ki-Yinjik mound at Nineveh, when his workmen told him of ancient sculptures recently found at Khorsabad, a large mound on the river Kosa, 12 miles to the northeast. In March 1843, he transferred his activities to this site and was soon busily excavating in the building, which we now know was King Sargon II's palace. His success was immediate, and his findings were similar to those that astonished Layard 2 years later at Nimrud. The following year, he had the good fortune to be joined by E. Flandine, a remarkable draftsman, who systematically recorded the reliefs and other sculptures now brought to light in almost overwhelming numbers. At Khorsabad, Sargon had selected a site where, as at Nimrud, a small ancient mound already existed, which could conveniently be reshaped to form a raised emplacement for his palace buildings. The city he laid out was square, with sides designed the city as a square, its sides spanning over a mile each, encircled by towering walls featuring 7 gateways. The wall and its inner part were surrounded, as American excavators discovered in the 1930s, by an inner citadel at ground level, containing other public buildings. Also at Nimrud, there was an imperial arsenal in the southern corner of the town. In conformity with Assyrian tradition, Sargon's palace was planned around 2 main courtyards, the innermost of which was used for ceremonial purposes. Where Botta's excavations are concerned, it is made clear in the 5-volume record of his work, which he and Flandin published in 1849-50, that they were limited to the projecting suite of staterooms on the northwest side. They lasted until 1846, but after the political events of 1848 in Paris, Botta was disgraced and sent to an obscure consular post in the Levant for some reason. By then, like Layard, he had come to understand that the city he had been excavating was not, as he had thought, Nineveh. At Khorsabad in 1852, Botta was replaced by Victor Place. The artist Felix Thomas accompanied him as his principal assistant. And it is to him that we owe the only surviving records of major finds made by the French expedition that year and the following year. We traced the palace plan and extracted the better preserved sculptures and many smaller finds for transport to Paris. According to Place's calculation, at the end of 1853, he had cleared 209 chambers grouped around 31 courts, in addition to 3 temples and a small ziggurat. He had traced the circuit of the city walls, 24 meters thick on stone foundations, and he had examined 7 gateways, 3 with sculptured portal figures, and 3 on his plan, with its vaulted archways and archivolts ornamented in coloured glaze, almost intact. By 1855, with his records completed, he was ready to return to France. And it was in that year that the great disaster took place. The story is today generally known. The Khorsabad sculptures travelled safely as far as Baghdad, where the 235 cases were loaded with antiquities from other sources onto a large country boat and 2 kelek rafts bound for Basra. Near Kurna, where the Tigris is joined by an affluent from the Euphrates, the convoy was attacked by hostile tribesmen, and all 5 vessels were capsized. Fortunately, an earlier consignment, shipped to France by Botta in 1847, had arrived safely. But today, this modest collection, together with 2 winged bull figures in the British Museum, represents all that remains of the French finds at Khorsabad, Nineveh. As we have mentioned, the ruins of Nineveh received attention from English and French excavators during the activity we have been discussing. Its city walls, now some distance from the Tigris, form an irregular rectangle, almost 7.5 miles in circumference, with an outer rampart and ditch on the eastern side. The palace mound, known by the Turkish name Kuyunjik, marks the line of the western wall facing the river. 1 mile to the south, a second, smaller mound covers the ruins of the Assyrian arsenal. And at its summit today, the houses of an Arab village cluster around a Muslim shrine, associated with the name of the prophet Jonah, Nebi Yunus. Entrances to the city, firmly identified, are the Nergal Gate in the north wall, with its guardian figures still preserved, and to the east, the Shamash Gate. Recent excavations have exposed and partially restored these entrances, along with the adjoining fortifications. During his first campaign at Nimrud, Layard had found time to continue Botta's soundings in the Kia Yinjik Mound at Nineveh. But it was not until June 1847 that his expectations in that quarter were realized. In the southern corner of the citadel, he came upon the walls of an enormous building that proved to be Sennacherib's principal palace, but he was compelled to postpone its further exploration while he returned temporarily to London. When he resumed work there in 1849, he was disappointed to find evidence that the palace had been destroyed by fire, perhaps during the sack of Nineveh in 612 BC. The damage, however, proved to be less than he had expected, and much of the sculpture he exposed over 2,000 sculptured slabs in the 71 chambers he investigated were exposed. At the same time, 2 small rooms, numbered 40 and 41 in his plan, were found to contain great quantities of tablets, comprising a part of Sennacherib's library, a prodigious storehouse of contemporary knowledge, with detailed records of contemporary events. At this time, Layard also made a less successful attempt to excavate in the unoccupied part of the Nebi Yunus Mountain. He discovered inscriptions belonging to Adad-nirari, Sennacherib, and Esarhaddon, but the inhabitants' hostility compelled him to halt his excavation. RK. In 1851 he finally returned home, leaving the excavations in charge of Hormuz Rassam. Layard had reached an understanding with Victor Place that British excavations should be restricted to the southern half of the Ki Yinjik Mound, and Place, now asserted his right to explore the northern Rassam, returned to Mosul in 1852. He contested this agreement and took drastic measures. Resorted to the expedient of working under the cover of darkness, he had the good fortune to discover the great northwest palace of Ashur-banipal, which he claimed for the British Museum. In addition to the famous lion hunt sequence of sculptures, the building also contained the remaining half of the Royal Library. This was the triumphant culmination of the British excavations at Nineveh. It should be added, however, that a highlight in Rassam's own subsequent explorations was his discovery in 878 of Imgur-Enlil, a country seat of the Assyrian kings at Balawat, 25 miles east of Mosul. From a low mound at this site, he extracted 2 pairs of huge bronze gates, set up by Ashur-nasirpal and Shalmaneser III at the entrances. We will refer to these in greater detail, along with a 3rd pair that Malouin found. Greater detail. From the above account of excavations in the ruins of late Assyrian cities, it will already have become evident that secular buildings now take precedence over temples. The king-emperors of this age were more concerned with constructing fortifications and planning pretentious royal palaces than with the religious shrines occasionally annexed to them. As one ruler succeeded another, the palaces multiplied in number and were enlarged or reconstructed, usually without respect to the overall planning of the great platforms on which they stood, and their ultimate destruction added to the confusion of their surviving ruins. This was the case at Nimrud, and even more at Nineveh, where the architectural record has remained regrettably incomplete. If, by contrast, we turn to Khorsabad, we find a city built, occupied, and abandoned in the space of a single generation. It remains uncomplicated by problems of stratigraphy, and has been excavated and recorded with considerable over a long period. Therefore, for our current purpose, we can accept it as a model that most effectively illustrates the principles of planning and construction favoured by contemporary builders. The American excavators who returned to Khorsabad in 1928 did much to amplify the finds of their French predecessors. After clearing an undecorated city gate, number 7 in Botta's plan, they set about re-excavating parts of the palace while removing certain sculptures rejected by Botta for lack of transport facilities. In 1930, a second gate, A, was found, ornamented with winged bulls and genii, which led to the discovery of an inner citadel surrounding the ground-level palace. Under the direction of Gordon Loud, the following years were spent exposing the many buildings enclosed by the citadel wall, while at the same time examining the great arsenal establishment in the southern corner of the city, known to place as Palace F. Lord conducted a new survey in the citadel, checking and correcting Place's palace plan. From this, one could draw a striking conclusion about the inadequacy of Assyrian building methods in their initial stages. Even the platform proved asymmetrically planned, while the layout of buildings in the citadel appeared haphazard to the point of inconvenience. At the approach from Gate A, a large temple dedicated to the god Nabu was sited at an awkward angle, beside a paved street. This building was elevated to the palace level and accessible by a bridge over the road. Beyond it was an open space from which a broad ramp led up to the main portal of the palace. And facing this, again, off-center, was a secondary citadel gateway. Loud excavated 5 minor palaces within these inner walls, adapting their plans with obvious difficulty to the available sites. This curious absence of preliminary planning would appear to have been characteristic of monumental buildings at all periods in Mesopotamian history. In the main palace, as we have said, the ceremonial apartments and staterooms were planned around an inner courtyard, dominated on one side by a sculptural composition of winged bulls and other figures, guarding the 3 entrances to the throne room. This huge rectangular chamber had walls about 12 meters high, decorated with mural paintings from pavement to ceiling, and a throne emplacement with relief carvings at one end. At the other, a vestibule led to a stairway, giving access to the flat on the roof. And a doorway near the throne brought one through a long robing room to the private courtyard around which the residential apartments were grouped. This arrangement of a throne room, with subsidiary chambers and a stairway, has been an architectural convention universally adopted in all Assyrian palaces. And here at Khorsabad, it can again be recognized in the reception suites of minor buildings in the lower citadel. A second convention dictates the composition of an isolated group of staterooms on the northwest side of Sargon's palace, where doorways lead out onto an open terrace. Loud found an identical arrangement of chambers in the residential part of the southern arsenal. The Nabu temple, with its 2 outer courtyards and conventionally planned sanctuary, is the most conspicuous where religious buildings are concerned. But Loud also re-excavated the assemblage of 3 smaller temples annexed to the palace on the southwest side. One of these, the Sin Temple, revealed a well-preserved facade. The facade featured reeded panels on both sides of the arched doorway, sprang from small projecting platforms faced with glazed brick ornaments in bright colors. Beside each was a tall artificial palm tree and a female statue of the flowing vase type, all extremely reminiscent of the mural painting from Mari, on which we commented earlier. The small ziggurat adjoining these temples was too denuded to examine further. But, if Place's reconstruction can be relied upon, it had a spiral ascending stairway dividing it into successive stages, each painted a different color. Regarding the Arsenal Palace, Ekal-Masharti, at Khorsabad, which Loud took as the residence of Sennacherib when he was crown prince, one point of interest could now be established. Stone column bases found by Plas in its ruins had brought to mind an inscription in which Sargon claimed to have built a palace of the Syrian kind, known as Bit Pilani, with a columned loggia in front of the throne room. But Loud was able to show that the position of the columns in the building did not conform to this theory, and Sargon's Hilani must, therefore, be sought elsewhere. More needs to be added about the plan since, as we shall At Khorsabad, the walls of every description were made of mud brick. Unlike the usual practice, Khorsabad rarely used mortar. Instead, the bricks were laid in a soft, pliable condition, only partially dried after casting. They used large quantities of kiln-baked bricks for facings and pavements. The dressed stonework reached a height of 3.0 meters at the base of the city walls, which were over 20 meters thick. Behind this facing, the undressed stone was roughly laid to form a base for the brick upper structure, which terminated in a crenellated parapet with stone merlons. Here, as elsewhere in Assyria, the stone, which may be described as gypseous alabaster, now known as Mosul marble, was easily obtained from local quarries in very large blocks, if necessary. The palace platform had a facing of stone in blocks up to 2.7 meters long, weighing as much as 23 tons apiece. The portal sculptures and the orthostat slabs, which carved the reliefs, were the main uses of the remaining stone. The building exclusively used these latter slabs to form an ornamental dado along the bases of the walls. Before building the brick upper structure, the Americans discovered that they had placed the rows of slabs and carved their reliefs in situ. Where slabs occurred on both faces of a wall, the space in between was filled with rubble, composed partly of masons' chippings. The thresholds of important doorways also utilized stone, featuring huge slabs carved with carpet-like designs. These thresholds served both a practical and symbolic purpose, marking the transition from the public to the private space of the palace. Regarding roofing, traces were found in the city gates of barrel vaulting in brick, and pitched brick vaulting was used in the drainage system of the palace platform. But in the palace itself, Laud satisfied himself that flat ceilings were the rule, sometimes with painted beams. Wood was comparatively plentiful. Cedar, cypress, juniper, and maple were among the species recognized, and from fallen beams he calculated that it was available in scantlings, capable of spanning the widest chambers. Sculptures in the round of this period are, for some reason, remarkably rare. A few isolated portraits of royalty have survived, the best preserved examples being more than half life-size. That of Ashur-nasirpal II, found in the Ninurta temple at Nimrud, which may be taken as typical, has been described as dull and impersonal. Yet the figure of this king, bareheaded and draped in the simple fringed shawl that was the court dress of Assyria, has an indisputable dignity. By contrast, the most conspicuous and characteristic class of sculptures in this category are the Lamassu guardian figures with which the gateways and palaces of Assyrian cities were adorned. These hybrid colossi, winged and human-headed bulls, or lions, were usually double-aspect figures, set facing outwards against the reveals of doorways, with a fifth leg, intended to rationalize their appearance from in front and from the side. They carved each monolithic monster partially in relief and partially in the round, from a single slab of stone that measured up to 5.5 meters square. The quarry shaped it roughly, transported it to its destination, often by river, and set it in place for the final carving. These figures served a dual purpose, as protective spirits and as symbols of the king's power. Late Assyrian sculptors' most spectacular achievement was in the relief carving realm. They did a great job of using this medium to make picture designs that could be used to decorate interior walls. It was a technical achievement, but their ability to use abstract expression took their work to a higher level of creativity. As for the reliefs, from the time of Ashur-nasirpal onward, they were primarily concerned with the king's victorious campaigns against the armies and cities of dissident dependencies. This theme becomes almost monotonous and repetitive. Frankfurt has put it, "We see the march of armies, subjugating, burning, and punishing in country after country." The war chariot is a recurrent motif, and one sees them advancing against a retreating enemy, while infantry dispatches the wounded, left upon the field. Opposition is centered on a city. It is taken, its leaders are impaled or killed in other ways, then the inexorable chariotry presses on again. The artists achieve variety by implying the geographical context of these events and the national traits of Assyria's diverse adversaries. Carefully and vividly presented, these are more remarkable when one considers the medium's limitations and the artist's ignorance of perspective. In these circumstances, pre-Greek art is unparalleled in its use of ingenious devices to suggest spatial recession, particularly in depicting landscapes, are ornamented with separate horizontal bands of bronze plating, 28 centimeters wide and hardly more than 2 millimeters thick, running from side to side and continuing around the pivot shaft. These bands are made using a repoussé technique and have scenes in relief that look like stone carvings from other places. Each strip has 2 registers, so the design can't be taller than 3 centimeters. The scenes here are once more of a narrative or episodic character, but lively and revealing. A victory is won over the Chaldeans among the palm groves of Lower Mesopotamia. On the Mediterranean coast, the island fortress of Tyre is captured, and the tribute of its ruler is brought ashore in boats to the Assyrian camp. In southern Urartu, the army's advance is hampered by hills and forests. However, a unique incident also unfolds in the north. In a mountain cave, the king has discovered what he takes to be the source of the Tigris. He makes appropriate sacrifices with the soldiers up to their waists in the water, while a sculptor carves a rock relief to commemorate the occasion. The third pair of gates from Balawat, now restored and returned to the Iraq Museum, adds new installments to the same pictorial history. Dubionje Yososbionje. After the Assyrian revival in the mid-8th century BC, Tiglath-Pileser III built himself a provincial palace at Tel Asmar, on the Euphrates in Syria, in which mural paintings were substituted for relief sculptures in stone. 264. The designs were in red, blue, and black on a background of white plaster, and their subjects were very similar to those of the stone reliefs. Episodes in the king's military campaigns alternated with hunting scenes, and paintings of winged genii replaced portal sculptures. Only recently did the Louvre reconstruct these murals in colour for publication. Stone reliefs from palaces of Tiglath-Pileser's successors in the 8th and 7th centuries show changing characteristics. Static compositions representing court ceremonies replace the narrative in the staterooms at Khorsabad. The huge figures of the king and his courtiers, some 2.75 meters high, follow or confront each other in hierarchical formality, and one notices the coloured paint sparingly applied to their hair, beards, and the exposed parts of their bodies. The artists of Sennacherib's time later exploited the possibilities offered by these larger slabs for pictorial compositions of a different kind. Historical episodes could now be elaborated on a much less restricted scale, and concurrent incidents could be added to a central theme. For this purpose, artists often abandoned dividing a picture into horizontal registers. A single design might now extend to the full height of the slabs, while new formulas could be devised to imply relative distance or dramatic priority. We added new landscape details to enhance the panoramic effect of these compositions. It would be impossible here to enumerate the many and varied subjects chosen by the artists of this period. 266. Almost all are concerned with violence and the destructive effects of punitive warfare. The accompanying inscriptions identifying historical events and individual personalities lend special interest to some. After the capitulation of Lachish in Palestine, Sennacherib may be seen receiving his officers and their suppling captives, or he's shown during one of his campaigns in the marshes of southern Mesopotamia, watching from an island. At the same time, his soldiers pursue the enemy in boats through the reed beds and fishy waters of the lagoon. Ashurbanipal celebrates the capture of Susa to the sound of music, with a quaint bird's-eye view of the city behind him, contemplating the gruesome aftermath of heavy fighting, or accompanied by his wife. He relaxes on a couch in an arbor of vines. In this last phase of Assyrian relief carving, the drawing of animals receives particular care and attention. It reached a peak of accomplishment in the time of Ashurbanipal, when hunting scenes depicting lions, wild asses, or gazelles became popular subjects. For here, perhaps deliberately, a note of pathos is introduced, and one's sympathy is aroused for the dying lioness or the onager mare who is compelled to abandon her foal. A more useful aspect of the reliefs from an archaeological point of view is the extensive detailed information they give about how the Assyrians and nearby groups they fought with looked and behaved. A painstaking study of these pictorial records has acquainted us with every smallest detail of military equipment and common practices in its use, which the written texts alone could never have made clear. Little remains to learn about the aspects of Assyrian life that the reliefs illustrate. The British returned to Nimrud. Some account must now be given of the finds made by a British expedition under M.E.L. Malawan's leadership, who returned to Nimrud in 1949 and worked there for a further 14 years. Malawan at first concentrated on the Northwest Palace, where the central ceremonial block of buildings excavated by Layard had included a massive throne room. A side chamber adjoining the throne yielded his first significant discovery. This was a commemorative stela of Ashurnasirpal II, bearing an effigy of the king in relief, and an inscription of 153 lines covering both sides of the stone. It is a monument of special interest because it records the ceremonies and festivities arranged to celebrate the formal opening of the palace in the year 879 BC. And it includes details of the food prepared for the entertainment of 69,574 persons over 10 days. Other information of this sort enabled Malawan to calculate the approximate population of Kala itself, after Ashurnasirpal had made it his new capital. The figure where he arrived, at least 86, including children, makes an intriguing comparison with the 6,000 inhabitants attributed to Nineveh in the Old Testament, Jonah 4:11. Meanwhile, Layard investigated 2 deep wells in the palace's eastern domestic wing. In one of these, Abi, which had been partly excavated by Layard, a find was made whose significance became clear after it had been examined in the British Museum laboratory. This was a book composed of 15 or more leaves, joined by golden hinges to open inwards and outwards like a Japanese screen. The leaves of wood and ivory had raised edges to protect a wax surface, on which inscriptions were engraved in cuneiform. Together they composed a written document of several thousand lines. The cover bore the name of Sargon II, together with the title of the text, and a note to say that the book should be kept in the king's new palace at Dur Sharukin, Khorsabad. Until then, contemporary evidence of writing on a wax surface had been found only in Phrygia, but Malawan was reminded of a later Babylonian inscription, in which the officer who read the omens to the king was instructed, when the reading was over, to close the book. A phrase that was difficult to understand, supposing that it was a tablet from which he was reading. From a second well in this part of the palace, NN, Malawan recovered several objects, now considered the covered boards of ivory, hinged to unfold. Malawan darkened the wax's colour with a yellow orpiment, sulfide of arsenic, to enhance the readability of the inscription. The size of each board was 33.8 by 15.6 centimetres. We will discuss the greatest masterpieces in the Nimrud ivories. Category. First came the strikingly beautiful female head, perhaps an ornament from some piece of furniture, which came to be known by the excavators as the Mona Lisa. Measuring 16 by 13.3 centimetres, the ivory of which it was made had matured to a warm brown colour, and its features, lightly stained with colouring, have been compared by Malawan stylistically to those of archaic Greek sculptures. There was a second head of the same sort, much more crudely carved, and both are dated to about 700 BC. Even more aesthetically effective than either of these objects were the two ivory, or rather chryselephantine plaques, representing a lioness killing a Negro against a formal background of lotuses. They are about 10 centimeters high, elaborately enriched with gold leaf and colored incrustations. The British Museum has closely studied the cloisonné process that decorates them. Malouin also dug up the northern wing, the chancery of the Northwest Palace, and the Ninurta temple at the base of the ziggurat. He also dug up the southwest complex with Loftus's burnt palace, the Nabu temple, Izida, and the governor's palace next door. He also dug up a large group of private homes and the Great Quay Wall, which supported the western or riverside of the citadel platform. All these building remains were methodically recorded, and successive phases in their architectural history were distinguished. During these years, Malouin was not primarily searching for large statues or reliefs, but his work was amply rewarded by finds on a smaller scale. Bronze vessels or weapons, fine ivory carvings, and deposits of unbaked tablets, objects of a sort that earlier excavators had been incapable of preserving. But his most notable discoveries were made after the expedition transferred its activities to the huge, hitherto unexcavated group of buildings in the remote southeast corner of the outer town. This was the imperial arsenal, Ekal Mashati of Shalmaneser III. All three of the late Assyrian capitals have buildings that fit this description. The arsenal at Nineveh remains buried beneath the modern buildings of Nebi Yunus. Still, an inscribed prism from that quarter describes its reconstruction in the reign of Esarhaddon. Another passage defines the purpose of such a building, stating that it was for the ordnance of the camp, for the maintenance of the stallions, mules, chariots, weapons, equipment of war and spoils of the enemy of every kind. It also records how, annually at the time of the New Year's festival, the establishment was subject to inspection by the king, for whom residential quarters were provided. The arsenal at Nimrud, known to the excavators as Fort Shalmaneser, occupied a rectangular site measuring 300 by 200 meters, enclosed on the east and south sides by the city wall and elsewhere by its own massive fortifications. David Oates, who took charge of its excavation in 1958, thought it had also been provided with an outer bailey. There is evidence of a similar arrangement at Khorsabad. The fortress divided itself into 5 main sections. In the center was a broad parade ground, with a throne dais on one side for the king. 2 large courtyards to the north of this were surrounded by the functional accommodation of an official entrepot, workshops for carpenters, smiths, leather workers or armorers, often with their tools and appliances preserved among the litter of scale armor, and in one case, a royal statue under repair. Elsewhere, stores for food and wine adjoined the administrative offices and adjutants' quarters. A third court to the west of the parade was divided into spacious magazines arranged around smaller light wells. The entire south side of the building was occupied by the royal residence, of which the ceremonial section, with its entrance from the parade ground, was composed of 2 elements. Their plans conforming precisely to architectural conventions that we have already observed at Khorsabad and elsewhere. Specifically, the reception suite comprised a large rectangular throne room and a projecting wing that housed the state. Spirited relief carvings representing the receipt of tribute from Syria and Chaldea decorated the stone dais which had survived the throne room. The principal subject was an encounter between Shalmaneser and the contemporary ruler of Babylon, in which the 2 kings actually clasped hands. Almost equally impressive was the pictorial panel in glazed brick, fallen from above the doorway in an adjoining chamber, in which the figure of the Assyrian king appears in duplicate beneath a winged disc. At Fort Shalmaneser, however, the most rewarding discovery was the contents of storage chambers in and around the southwest courtyard on the western side of the parade grounds. The rooms held a vast collection of ivory carvings designed to adorn furniture, chariots, or parade harnesses. They were piled up or spread out on all the room's debris levels. They comprised plaques with high or low reliefs, large figures of animals or people, and some subjects carved in the round. They were the work of Phoenician or Syrian artists who stole from Western cities. The thousands of recovered fragments have yielded hundreds of restored items, many of which have found publication. The Nimrud ivories. We already have reason to mention a study of late Assyrian ivories by R.D. Barnett during the years preceding Malouin's excavation at Nimrud. This was based on a collection that had been retained for almost a century in the British Museum, and it proved to be derived from two sources: Layard's finds in the Northwest Palace and Loftus's discoveries in the Burnt Palace. Unlike these early excavators, Barnett could now compare these ivories with more recent finds from Palestine, Syria, Anatolia, and Cyprus sites. At an early stage in his study of their stylistic characteristics, it became abundantly clear that in both groups, most designs were Phoenician craftsmen's work in the Levant's coastal cities. This was notably so in the group from the Northwest Palace, which consisted mainly of furniture enrichment, like the parts of a royal throne said by Layard to have been found in well A.B. Some examples of standard designs, such as the woman at the window, the Phoenician goddess Astarte, or the cow turning its head to lick a suckling calf, were marked by their makers with a sign corresponding to a letter in the Phoenician alphabet. In others, Egyptianizing designs pointed to the same origin. On the other hand, Barnett said he saw a Syrian style that was separate and linked to a centre further inland in the Loftus group. This style used non-Phoenician patterns and designs on different types of objects. These included caryatid figures, model shrines, and pyxis vessels for ointment. He also suspected the presence of this group of objects manufactured in Assyria, perhaps by imported artisans. Barnett's Nimrud Ivories was eventually published in 1957, and during the years that followed, as we have seen, a huge volume of new material became available. When Malouin studied his own findings 9 years later, he confirmed many of the earlier conclusions. However, he was hesitant to agree with Barnett's clear separation between Phoenician and Syrian work, since craftsmen may have been able to freely trade in all markets west of the Euphrates then. On the other hand, he also detected a whole school of imported artists and indigenous carvers, owing little except their technique to foreign influence. Regarding the purpose and setting of the ivories, Malouin gained the impression that this highly prized luxury material was applied as a veneer to every conceivable form of furniture. One room at Fort Shalmaneser contained many panels juxtaposed in their original setting, and these, at least, could be identified as the elaborate ornamental backs of beds, couches, and chairs. In this connection, he could point to the furniture so carefully depicted in relief already mentioned, in which Ashurbanipal and his wife are resting after the capture of Susa. He lists some other purposes and classes of objects for which ivory carving was used, and makes an intriguing comparison with a surviving inventory of spoil brought back by Sargon II from the cities of Urartu, where ivory was as popular as in Assyria. In considering the Levantine style of carving and its background, one is reminded that the Phoenician artisans by whom it was perfected were renowned, even in the Old Testament, for their skill and ingenuity. Nevertheless, where design was concerned, one also noticed that they lacked any authentically native tradition. Just as in Europe the artists of the Renaissance turned to ancient Greece for inspiration, so for the Phoenicians, Egyptian art provided the source of a ready-made idiom. However, Egyptian art was based on religious imagery and a huge repertory of symbolic and mythical forms. The Phoenicians did not claim ownership of the religion or its symbolism and made minimal efforts to comprehend it. Their adaptation of Egyptian imagery was accordingly often incorrect and occasionally clumsy. Surprisingly, its visual effect remained unimpaired. Chronologically, the Nimrud ivories could be dated to any period between Ashur-Nasirpal's reign and the eventual destruction of his capital. Adad-nirari III is known to have acquired an ivory bed and a couch from the king of Damascus in about 800 BC. Malouin dates most of his finds to Sargon II's reign more recently. The extinction of the Syrian elephant at